On the morning of October 17th, 1879, the aspen trees along the Bitterroot Valley floor burned gold against a sky the color of old pewter. Elijah Cross stood in the dooryard of his father's ranch house, holding a canvas rucksack that contained everything his family believed he was worth. 2 cotton shirts, a razor wrapped in oilcloth, a wool blanket that had belonged to his mother, a tin coffee cup hammered smooth by years of use, and a leather-bound notebook he had filled with geological surveys during 4 years at the Colorado School of Mines. The notebook had cost him 3 months of summer wages breaking horses for a freight company in Denver. His father had called it a waste of money spent on education that would never put food on a table. His eldest brother Garrett leaned against the porch rail with his arms folded across a chest gone thick with the kind of muscle that comes from 38 years of ranch work. His face was weathered to the texture of saddle leather, creased at the eyes and mouth in a way that made even his rare smiles look like grimaces. He was not smiling now. "You and your rock collecting," Garrett said, drawing the words out slow and deliberate like a man loading a rifle. "Pa left the ranch to men who understand what land is for, not men who stare at it through magnifying glasses." The second brother, Donovan, stood 3 steps behind Garrett like a shadow that had learned to walk upright. Donovan was 34 years old and had spent every one of those years trying to become the man his older brother already was. He had his hands shoved deep in his pockets and his eyes fixed on the porch boards that Elijah had replaced 2 summers ago when the old pine had finally rotted through. Donovan might have spoken once, might have argued for a fairer division of what their father Nathaniel Cross had built with his own scarred hands over 40 years of brutal Montana winters and summers that baked the grass to straw. There had been a time, years ago, when Donovan and Elijah fished together in the creek that ran through the eastern section of the property, and talked about what they would build when they were grown men with land of their own. But Donovan's wife Marion had settled that question 3 weeks before the funeral, in the kitchen of the main house, her voice low and curt as she sliced bread for the gathering that would follow the burial. 3 brothers and 6,000 acres of Montana bottomland, she had said, and 2 brothers are more than enough to manage it properly. Their father Nathaniel Cross had been dead 9 days. The lawyer had read the will in the parlor of the house Nathaniel had built in 1852, when Montana was still a territory so new that maps disagreed about where its borders ran. The eastern 2,400 acres with their creek access and rich soil went to Garrett, along with the main house and the rights to the water that made those acres worth having. The western 1,800 acres, drier and rockier but adequate for cattle if a man knew how to manage drought years, went to Donovan, along with the equipment and the breeding stock that Nathaniel had spent 2 decades assembling. To Elijah, the youngest, the one who had spent his evenings during his final year at home drawing diagrams of geological strata by lamplight, while his brothers played cards and drank the hard cider their father made each fall, Nathaniel Cross left exactly 1 item: a wooden case containing a set of surveying instruments that had belonged to Elijah's grandfather, Tobias Cross. The instruments were old, made sometime in the 1830s, their brass fittings gone green with age and their wooden handles worn smooth by decades of use in the field. There was a compass with a cracked glass face, a hand level with sighting vanes that no longer aligned properly, a measuring chain that had lost 3 of its links, a plumb bob that hung crooked, and a leather-bound field journal, its pages yellow and brittle, filled with notes in handwriting so faded that whole passages were illegible. Not a single acre, not a tool, not a horse or a cow or even a chicken, not the surveying equipment that Nathaniel himself had used to map his own property lines, but the broken relics that had been gathering dust in the barn loft since before Elijah was born. Garrett had laughed when the lawyer finished reading. It was a short, hard sound like a board cracking underfoot. Donovan had looked at his boots. Marion had smiled the way a person smiles when they find money in a coat pocket they had forgotten about, a small private expression of satisfaction at a problem neatly solved. The lawyer, a thin man named Arthur Pemberton with ink stains on his fingers and a conscience that occasionally troubled him in the small hours of the morning, had pulled Elijah aside afterward. They stood in the yard, while the rest of the family filed back into the house to finalize the division of property that the will had made legally inevitable. "You could contest it," Pemberton said quietly. His voice had the careful neutrality of a man who has learned not to get involved in family disputes, but who cannot quite stop himself from pointing out injustice when he sees it. Montana territorial law does not require equal division among heirs, but a court might look favorably on a case where one son receives substantially less than his brothers, particularly when that son has demonstrated competence and education that could be argued to increase his value to the estate. "No," Elijah said. The word came out flat and final. Pemberton studied him for a long moment. The wind moved through the aspens along the creek and carried with it the smell of coming snow. "You are certain?" "I am certain that fighting will not change what my father believed." Elijah looked toward the house, toward the windows where lamplight was beginning to show as the October afternoon faded toward evening. He watched me choose the School of Mines over staying here to work the land. He watched me spend 4 years learning geology and mineralogy and engineering, instead of learning how to manage cattle and predict weather and fix fence line. He believed that learning was a kind of betrayal. That a son who read books was a son who thought himself better than the dirt that fed him. Pemberton opened his mouth as if to argue, then closed it again. He was a lawyer and he understood convictions. He understood that some beliefs run so deep in a man that they become part of his bones, and no legal argument can extract them. Elijah picked up the wooden case containing his grandfather's instruments. It was lighter than he expected, as if time had leached the weight out of the brass and wood and left only the shape of tools behind. "What did my grandfather do with these?" Pemberton adjusted his spectacles. Tobias Cross was a surveyor before he was a rancher. He mapped the territory for the land office in the 1840s. "Good work, from what I understand. Precise." Elijah turned the case over in his hands. The wood was walnut, darkened by age and handling, with dovetail joints at the corners that fit together so tightly that no gaps showed even after 40 years. Someone had carved initials into the lid. TC 1838. "Did my father ever use these?" Pemberton shook his head. Nathaniel preferred to hire his surveying done. He said his father spent too much time measuring land and not enough time working it. Elijah almost smiled. So giving them to me was his way of saying I am like my grandfather, too interested in measurement to be useful. "Perhaps," Pemberton said. "Or perhaps it was his way of saying you come from a line of men who understood the land, even if you understand it differently than he did." Elijah looked at the lawyer for a long moment. Then he nodded once, picked up his rucksack, and walked away from the house where he had been born. Garrett was waiting by the gate. He had positioned himself deliberately, blocking the path, forcing Elijah to stop or go around. "Go find yourself some rocks to stare at," he said. "There is nothing here for you." Elijah looked past his brother at the field stretching toward the mountains, gold and brown in the autumn light. He knew every acre of those fields. He knew which sections drained poorly in spring and held standing water that drowned the roots of anything planted there. He knew where the soil ran too thin over bedrock to support deep-rooted crops, and where the creek deposited silt rich enough to grow corn that stood 8 feet tall by August. He had mapped the entire property during the summer of 1875, before he left for the School of Mines. filling a notebook with soil samples and drainage patterns and observations about which grasses came back strongest after drought. That notebook was probably kindling by now. Garrett had never seen the value in observation that did not lead directly to increased yields or easier work. Elijah shifted the rucksack on his shoulder and walked around his brother without saying a word. Words were just sounds. They could not hurt him unless he let them, and he had already decided not to let them. He walked west. The road that led away from the Cross Ranch ran along the valley floor for 3 miles before it began to climb into the foothills of the Bitterroot Range. By the time the sun touched the peaks behind him, Elijah was 4 miles from the house, and everything in the valley below was turning blue with distance and shadow. He did not look back. That night he slept under a ponderosa pine with his wool blanket wrapped around him and his rucksack as a pillow. The temperature dropped to near freezing, and his breath made clouds in the starlight. But he had grown up in Montana, and he knew how to be cold without panicking. He woke before dawn with frost on his blanket, and the absolute silence that comes to mountains on clear October mornings when the air is too cold for birdsong. He walked for 14 days. The Bitterroot Mountains in late October were no place for a man without proper provisions, but Elijah Cross was not without resources. He had grown up on the edge of these mountains, hunting elk and deer with his father during the years before Nathaniel decided that his youngest son was more interested in the rocks the animals walked on than in the animals themselves. His mother, who had died when Elijah was 14, of a fever that took her in 3 days and left the household permanently diminished in ways that went beyond cooking and laundry, had been half Shoshone. She had taught him the forest as fluently as she had taught him his letters. She had known which roots were food and which were poison, which bark could be chewed for its medicine, and which could be stripped and woven into cord, which mushrooms filled a belly and which stopped a heart. He ate serviceberries that the frost had sweetened to the edge of fermentation. He gathered pine nuts and cracked them between flat stones, picking out the small, oily meats with a thorn. He drank from streams so cold they made his teeth ache, water that tasted of stone and snow and the deep mineral memory of the earth. He slept in groves of aspen, whose white trunks glowed in the moonlight like the bones of some ancient creature. And twice he slept in the remains of old trappers' cabins, their log walls still standing but their roofs long since collapsed into rotting heaps of pine poles and shredded bark. On the 3rd day it rained, a cold, driving downpour that soaked through his wool blanket and turned the game trails into ribbons of mud. He spent that night shivering in a thicket of young spruce, packed in so tight that the branches kept most of the rain off but not all of it, and he thought about turning back. Not to the ranch. That door had closed as finally as a grave, but to some settlement where he could hire himself out as a laborer and stop this fool's errand of walking into the mountains with no destination and no plan beyond a vague notion that there was something ahead worth finding. But when morning came and the rain stopped and the mountains emerged from the mist like something the earth was dreaming into existence, he kept walking. Later in life, when people asked him about those 14 days, he would say only that he had felt pulled, not by anything mystical or supernatural, but by the same practical instinct that made him stop to examine an interesting rock formation or follow a creek upstream to see where the water came from. The sense that there was something ahead that needed to be found, and that he was the one meant to find it. On the 9th day he crossed into what he reckoned was the northern reach of the Bitterroot Range, where the mountains rose steep and raw from narrow valleys, and the trees gave way to exposed stone that showed the bones of the earth. The terrain here was different from the country around his father's ranch. Harder, older. The stone was not the sedimentary layers he had studied in Colorado, orderly strata laid down by ancient seas, but igneous rock, volcanic in origin, fractured and thrust upward by forces that had shaped the continent when the continent was young. He stopped on a ridge and looked north. In the distance, perhaps 10 miles away, a single peak rose above the surrounding mountains. It was not the tallest peak in the range, but it had a shape that caught his eye, a symmetry that suggested volcanic origins. Even from this distance, he could see that its flanks were bare of snow, while the peaks around it carried the first dustings of white from early autumn storms. Geothermal activity, he said aloud, and his voice sounded strange after days of silence. The snow melts off because the mountain is still warm. He altered his course north toward the peak. On the 11th day, following a game trail that wound through a forest of Douglas fir so thick that the ground beneath them was bare of undergrowth, he met an old man sitting on a log beside a spring. The man was Salish, perhaps 70 years old, with white hair worn in 2 braids, and a face seamed with wrinkles as deep as the cracks in drought-baked earth. He was smoking a pipe carved from soapstone, and he did not look surprised to see Elijah, as if white men with surveying equipment and no food often wandered past this particular spring. "You are looking for something," the old man said. It was not a question. Elijah set down his rucksack and knelt by the spring to fill his canteen. "Yes." "The warm mountain." Elijah stoppered the canteen and looked at the old man. "How did you know?" The old man smiled, showing gaps where teeth had been. "You are walking toward it. You have been walking toward it since you crossed the ridge 3 days ago. A man who wanders walks in circles. A man with purpose walks straight. My name is Elijah Cross. I am called Many Horses." The old man drew on his pipe and exhaled smoke that hung in the cold air like mist. "Though I have not owned a horse in 20 years, so the name is more memory than truth now." "Do you know the mountain I am looking for?" "I know it. My people called it where winter sleeps. The white men have no name for it because the white men do not go there. It is too far from any road and there is no gold. But there is something. There is warmth. The mountain breathes heat like a living thing. There are caves where the air is warm enough to dry meat in winter and cool enough to keep meat fresh in summer. My grandfather's grandfather stored food there when the buffalo were plentiful, and there was more meat than could be eaten before it spoiled." Elijah felt something shift in his chest, a recognition so strong it was almost physical. "How far?" 2 days north. Maybe less if you do not stop to measure every rock you pass." Elijah smiled despite himself. "You know something about rock measurers." Many Horses tapped his pipe against the log to knock out the ash. "I know that a man who looks at stone sees things other men miss. The white men who came to this country saw only gold or farmland or timber to be cut. They looked at the surface. Your people, the ones who measure and dig, you look deeper. Sometimes you see what is actually there." He reached into a leather bag at his side and pulled out a bundle wrapped in cloth. Dried elk meat, strips of it as dark as old leather and hard enough to break teeth if a man bit down wrong. He handed it to Elijah. "You will need food. The mountain is generous, but it does not provide meat." Elijah took the bundle. "What do I owe you?" Many Horses stood, moving with the careful slowness of old joints on a cold morning. "Tell me what you find there. That is payment enough. My people no longer use that place, and I would like to know if the white men will use it better or worse than we did." "How will I find you to tell you?" The old man smiled again. "If you find what you are looking for, I will hear about it. News travels, even to old men who live in the forest." He walked away through the trees, moving quietly for all his age, and within a dozen paces he had disappeared into the shadows between the fir trunks as completely as if he had never been there at all. Elijah walked for 2 more days. The mountain drew closer, its symmetrical cone rising above the surrounding peaks, and he began to see signs of the geothermal activity he had suspected. Steam vents along a creek bed, the water running warm even though the air temperature hovered just above freezing. Patches of ground bare of snow where heat rising from below kept the soil thawed. A smell of sulfur, faint but unmistakable, that came and went on the wind. On the morning of the 14th day, following the creek upstream into a narrow valley between two ridges, he found the cave. It was not dramatic. No yawning mouth in a cliff face, no cathedral entrance with stalactites dripping from a stone ceiling. It was a horizontal opening in a hillside, perhaps 6 feet tall and 12 feet wide, half hidden behind a curtain of young Douglas fir that had grown up in the decades since the last fire had cleared this slope. The creek ran 30 yards below, cutting through red volcanic rock that showed the layers of ancient eruptions, stone laid down in flows separated by centuries or millennia, each layer a different shade of red or gray or black. Elijah might have walked past it, even looking for it as he was, but he stopped because he felt it before he saw it. A warmth against his face, subtle but unmistakable, like standing near a stove that had been banked for the night but still held heat in its iron belly. He pushed through the first saplings and stood at the cave entrance. The air coming from the opening was warm, not hot, not like the steam vents he had passed lower in the valley, but warm in a way that had nothing to do with sunlight. It was the warmth of the earth itself, rising from depths where the planet's internal heat had not yet dissipated, carried upward through fractures in the stone, and released here in this quiet exhalation that had probably been flowing for thousands of years. He held his hand in the current of air. The temperature was perhaps 50 degrees, though the morning air around him was cold enough to freeze the dew on the fir needles. His breath made clouds when he exhaled outside the cave. Inside the opening, his breath was invisible. Elijah pulled his grandfather's surveying case from his rucksack and opened it. The instruments inside looked even more worn in the daylight, relics of another era when men had mapped territory that existed on no official charts. He took out the compass and the hand level, then reached deeper into the case and found what he was looking for. A mercury thermometer, its glass tube carefully wrapped in wool cloth, marked in degrees Fahrenheit with increments small enough to measure differences of a single degree. He unwrapped the thermometer and held it in the warm air flowing from the cave entrance. The mercury rose steadily and stopped at 53 degrees. He stepped back into the cold morning air and watched the mercury fall to 32. 21 degrees warmer inside than outside. 21 degrees of warmth that came from the earth with no fire, no fuel, no human effort required. Just the patient heat of stone that had been absorbing and releasing energy in a cycle older than anything alive on its surface. Elijah lit the candle stub he carried in his rucksack and stepped into the cave. The entrance passage ran back into the hillside for perhaps 15 feet, the floor slightly downward sloping, the walls rough volcanic stone that had fractured in vertical sheets when it cooled from molten rock to solid. Then the passage widened into a chamber. He held the candle high and turned slowly, letting the small circle of light reveal the space around him. The chamber was roughly 20 feet across and 15 feet deep, with a ceiling high enough that he could stand upright without ducking. The floor was packed earth covered with a thin layer of dust and small fragments of stone that had fallen from the ceiling over however many centuries this cave had existed. The walls were dry in some places and damp in others, a fine film of moisture that caught the candlelight and made the stone gleam like wet skin. And the temperature, that beautiful, steady, life-sustaining temperature that wrapped around him like a hand on his shoulder and promised warmth when the world outside offered only cold. He walked the perimeter of the chamber, holding the thermometer at different heights, moving it close to the walls and then out into the center of the space. The mercury never wavered below 52 or rose above 54. 2 degrees of variation in the entire chamber, while outside the temperature would swing 30 or 40 degrees between the cold of night and the brief warmth of midday sun. At the back of the chamber he found a second opening, narrower than the first, barely wide enough for a man to pass through sideways. He squeezed through it and found himself in a smaller chamber, this one perhaps 12 feet across, with a ceiling so low he had to crouch. The air here was cooler by a degree or two, and when he held the candle close to the back wall he saw why. A fissure ran vertically through the stone, too narrow to pass through but wide enough to admit a steady flow of air. He wet his finger and held it near the fissure. The air moving through it was coming from somewhere higher on the mountain, drawn downward by the pressure differential between the warm air in the cave and the cold air outside. Natural ventilation, he said to no one. The mountain is breathing. He spent 2 hours exploring the cave system, finding 3 distinct chambers connected by narrow passages, and a 4th fissure that opened to the outside somewhere high on the slope above the main entrance. Warm air rose through the hillside and exited through that upper fissure, creating a gentle circulation that moved through all 3 chambers at the speed of a slow walk. Enough airflow to prevent the stagnation that would breed mold and rot, but not enough to create drafts that would dry out whatever was stored here. When he finally emerged from the cave, the sun had climbed to its zenith, and the temperature outside had risen to perhaps 45 degrees. He stood at the entrance and looked down at the valley below, at the creek running over its red stone bed, at the forest of fir and pine stretching away to the south. Then he looked at the hillside above the cave, where a stand of aspen grew among the darker conifers, their white trunks stark against the green. Elijah Cross sat down on a flat stone near the cave entrance and did something he had not done since his mother's funeral 16 years before. He wept, not from sadness, though sadness was threaded through it like a dark vein in pale stone, but from the sudden overwhelming recognition that the earth itself was offering him what his family had refused: shelter, a place, the raw materials of a life. He had been given broken instruments and a dead man's journal, and told they were all he was worth. But his grandfather had known something, had left him not just tools but a map to something that mattered more than acres or cattle or water rights. Had left him the knowledge that there was a place where a man who understood stone could build something that would outlast any ranch, any herd, any fortune made from the sweat of animals and the luck of weather. When the tears stopped, he opened his grandfather's field journal. The pages were brittle and the ink had faded to brown, but he had looked through it before during the long evenings at the School of Mines when his classmates were drinking in the saloons of Denver, and he was alone in his boarding house room. Most of the entries were surveying notes, measurements and bearings and descriptions of land features written in the efficient shorthand of a man who spent his days in the field. But there were other entries too, observations that had nothing to do with property lines or mineral rights. He turned pages carefully, looking for anything that mentioned this region, and on a page dated June 1843 he found it. Reached the northern range today. Found warm springs in the high valleys and evidence of volcanic activity more recent than the regional surveys suggest. Tested several vents with mercury thermometer. One cave system showed constant temperature of 54 degrees regardless of external conditions. Considered filing mineral claim, as volcanic regions often contain valuable deposits. Then a line had been drawn through the next sentence. The ink pressed hard enough to tear the paper slightly, and below it new words had been written. Spent 3 days thinking about what this place could be. A mine would destroy it. A ranch would ignore it. But a man who understood what constant temperature means for preservation, for storage, for the keeping of food through seasons when food is scarce, that man could do something worth doing here. Marked the location. Told no one. Someday one of my line will need this more than I do. The coordinates were listed below in Tobias Cross's careful hand, and they matched the location where Elijah now sat. He turned to the final pages of the journal, entries from 1850 and 1851, the last years before Tobias had died of pneumonia in the winter of 1852. The handwriting here was less steady, the letters formed with the slight tremor of a man whose hands were beginning to fail him. The entry dated November 1851 read, "Built the ranch, raised cattle, made money enough to buy more land and more cattle and to give my sons a start at prosperity. But the prosperity is fragile. It depends on weather and markets and 100 things beyond any man's control. The cave in the north depends on nothing but the earth's own heat, which will flow long after my sons and their sons are dust. I have not told Nathaniel about it. He would see only wasted potential, land that could be grazed or timber that could be cut. He looks at surfaces. The boy who reads this, you are reading because you look deeper. You see what is actually there instead of what you want to be there. Go north. The mountain is patient. It will wait for you." Below that, separated by space as if Tobias had stopped writing and then returned to the page later, a final line. "The boy who finds this, you were right to be different. Different is where progress lives." Elijah closed the journal and sat holding it in both hands while the sun moved across the sky and the shadows of the aspens grew long across the hillside. His grandfather had been dead 27 years, had never met him, had died before Elijah was born. But somehow across the gap of decades and death, Tobias Cross had known that one of his descendants would be different, would see the world as stone and process and potential rather than as property to be owned and extracted. Had left a map and a message, and trusted that the right person would find it. That night Elijah slept inside the cave for the first time. He spread his wool blanket on the packed earth floor of the main chamber, and lay down in darkness so complete he could not see his hand in front of his face. The temperature held at 53 degrees. Outside, he knew, it would drop to freezing or below. But here in the mountain's embrace the warmth was constant and gentle and absolutely reliable. He slept more soundly than he had in 14 days of rough camping, and when he woke in the darkness with no way to tell if it was midnight or near dawn, he lay still and listened to the mountain breathe. The faint whisper of air moving through stone, the quiet respiration of the earth itself, a rhythm that had continued for millennia and would continue for millennia more. In the morning, he emerged into daylight and began to explore the area around the cave entrance. The hillside above was steep but not impassable, covered with a mix of aspen and fir, and a few struggling pines that had taken root in the thin soil between outcroppings of volcanic rock. Below the cave the slope gentled and there was a bench of relatively flat land, perhaps half an acre, where soil had accumulated in a depression and grass grew thick. He knelt and dug into the soil with his hands. 6 inches of topsoil, dark and rich, over fractured volcanic rock that would drain well. The location faced south, which meant maximum sun exposure during the growing season. The creek was close enough to carry water for irrigation if needed. "This could be planted," he said to the empty hillside. "Potatoes, turnips, carrots, anything that stores well in cold." He spent that day and the next simply observing, walking the perimeter of the area, studying the land the way he had been trained to study geological formations, not to possess or extract, but to understand. He noted where the sun hit and where shadows lingered. He tested the soil in a dozen places. He followed the creek upstream and found where it emerged from a spring higher on the mountain, the water so clear he could see every stone on the bottom. On the third day he opened his grandfather's surveying case again and took out the instruments one by one. The compass was cracked but still functional. The hand level could still sight a line if he adjusted for the misalignment. The measuring chain was short 3 links but he could work around that. The plumb bob hung true despite its tarnish. He began to survey the cave system properly, measuring the dimensions of each chamber, mapping the airflow patterns, recording temperatures at different times of day. He filled the first pages of a new notebook with observations and measurements, his handwriting neat and precise, each entry dated and timed. On the fifth day, he found something he had missed during his first exploration. In the smallest of the three chambers, hidden behind a rock fall that looked natural but on closer inspection had been deliberately arranged, he found a skeleton. Human, male, based on the size of the bones. Long dead, the bones yellow, white, and dry, scattered slightly by whatever small animals had made their way into the cave over the decades. And next to the skeleton, wrapped in oilcloth that had somehow remained intact, a surveying notebook. Elijah unwrapped the oilcloth with trembling hands. The notebook inside was identical to the one his grandfather had carried, the same size and binding and quality of paper. He opened it to the first page and saw the name written there in handwriting he recognized from the journal in his own pack. Tobias Cross, Field Notes, 1844. He turned pages, seeing survey measurements and geological observations, sketches of rock formations and notes about mineral content. And then, on a page dated May 1844, an entry that made his breath catch. Found silver vein in secondary chamber. Had it assayed in Missoula, 40% pure. Estimate minimum value of $10,000 at current prices. Enough to buy land, cattle, a future for my sons and their sons. But then below that, in different ink as if written later, came back to seal it today. Brought enough rock to hide the entrance completely. The silver can wait. The cave is worth more than any vein. A man who controls temperature controls preservation. A man who controls preservation controls the future. I will map this for whoever comes after me and understands what actually matters. The silver is insurance if it is ever needed, but the cave is the legacy. Below that, coordinates for the silver vein's location and a final note. To whoever finds this, you found it because you were looking in a cave instead of looking for a fortune. That means you understand. The choice is yours. Extract the silver and become wealthy for a generation. Preserve the cave and build something that lasts for centuries. Choose wisely. Elijah sat with the notebook in his lap for a long time. $10,000 in 1844 would be worth many times that now. Enough to buy back his father's ranch twice over. Enough to prove to Garrett and Donovan that the rock measurer had found something worth more than all their acres combined. But extracting the silver would require mining, would require opening the cave to the outside world, to investors and laborers and equipment, and all the disruption that came with the pursuit of mineral wealth, would require destroying the very thing that made this place valuable in a way that had nothing to do with money. He looked at the skeleton of his grandfather, at the bones that had lain here undiscovered for 35 years, and he understood why Tobias had come back to this cave one final time. Had come here knowing he was dying, had come here to be found by whoever would eventually discover what he had chosen to preserve instead of exploit. Elijah carefully rewrapped the notebook in its oilcloth and placed it back beside the bones. Then he spent the rest of the day moving rocks to seal the chamber completely, building a wall that looked like natural rockfall, hiding both the skeleton and the notebook, and the choice they represented. When he emerged from the cave that evening, the sun was setting, and the aspens on the hillside were gold fire against the darkening sky. He stood at the cave entrance and looked out at the valley below and the mountains rising beyond it, range after range fading into blue distance. His grandfather had chosen preservation over profit, had chosen to build something that would serve rather than something that would enrich, had chosen legacy over wealth, and in doing so had left a legacy worth more than any amount of silver. Elijah Cross made the same choice, not because it was easy or because he did not need money or because he was above the temptation of wealth, but because he understood what his grandfather had understood, that some things once destroyed cannot be rebuilt, that the value of constant temperature and reliable preservation would compound over time in ways that silver in a bank account never could, that the mountain had given him a gift, and the only way to honor that gift was to use it as it was meant to be used. He slept in the cave that night and dreamed of his grandfather standing at this same entrance, looking out at this same valley, making this same choice. And in the dream, his grandfather turned and saw him and nodded once, a gesture of recognition and approval across the gap of decades, and then turned back to watch the sun set on a world that had not yet learned to measure the worth of patience over the worth of gold. The first week Elijah Cross did nothing but watch. This was his nature, the quality that had most frustrated his brothers during the years they worked together on their father's ranch. Where Garrett would have immediately begun cutting timber and hauling stone and building whatever structure his instincts told him was needed, Elijah sat. He observed. He measured. He believed with the certainty of a man who had spent 4 years studying geology that understanding must precede action, that a man who built before he observed was a man who would spend the rest of his life tearing down and rebuilding what he should have gotten right the first time. He woke each morning in the cave's main chamber as the first gray light filtered through the entrance, and he spent his days mapping every detail of the system his grandfather had found and preserved. He recorded temperature readings 3 times daily using the mercury thermometer from the surveying kit. Dawn, noon, and dusk. He marked each reading in his notebook with the date and time, and the exact location within the cave where the measurement was taken. The main chamber averaged 53 degrees. The secondary chamber, deeper into the hillside and more insulated by the mass of stone above and around it, held at 51. The smallest chamber, the one where he had found his grandfather's remains, stayed coolest at 49 degrees. Outside, autumn was giving way to the first edge of winter. The morning temperatures dropped from the low 30s into the 20s. The aspens on the hillside lost their leaves in a single week of hard wind, and the bare white trunks stood out against the dark green of the fir and pine like bones against flesh. By midday, the sun might warm the air to 45 or 50 degrees if the sky was clear, but those warm afternoons were becoming rare. More often the clouds moved in from the west and settled over the mountains like a gray blanket, and the temperature stayed cold from dawn to dusk. Inside the cave, the mercury never wavered. 53 degrees in the main chamber regardless of whether it was 28 degrees outside at dawn or 42 at noon. A range of 3 degrees within the cave against a range of 25 degrees in the external air. The stone absorbed the wild swings of weather and temperature that characterized Montana autumns, and released only this steady, reliable warmth that had nothing to do with sun or season or any human effort. Elijah mapped the airflow using smoke from a candle made of tallow he had rendered from the last of the deer fat he carried. He held the smoking candle at different points within each chamber and watched how the smoke moved. In the main chamber, it drifted steadily toward the back, drawn by the air current that flowed from the entrance toward the deeper passages. In the secondary chamber, the smoke rose straight up and then curved back toward the front, pulled by the chimney effect that drew warm air upward through the fissure that opened somewhere high on the slope above. In the smallest chamber, the air barely moved at all, just a faint circulation that kept the atmosphere from going stale, but created no draft strong enough to dry out anything stored there. He spent an entire day tracing the ventilation system, squeezing through narrow passages and climbing over rockfalls until he found all the openings. The main entrance where he had first entered. A fissure the width of a man's forearm that ran vertically through the hillside and opened 40 feet above the entrance, barely visible among the aspen roots that gripped the rocky slope. And a third opening he had not noticed before, a crack in the stone on the western side of the secondary chamber that admitted a cross breeze from a different angle, creating the circulation pattern that kept the air fresh in all three chambers, without creating the kind of wind that would carry away the humidity the stone naturally held. On the 8th day, he began to make notes about what he had learned, not just measurements and temperatures, but observations about the relationship between the cave structure and its function. The way the entrance passage sloped slightly downward meant that cold air from outside, being heavier than warm air, would settle near the entrance and not penetrate deep into the system. The way the chambers were arranged in sequence, each one slightly deeper and slightly cooler than the last, created a temperature gradient that could be used to store different types of food at different optimal temperatures. The way the vertical fissure drew air upward created negative pressure at the entrance that pulled fresh air in continuously, but gently, a flow measured in feet per minute rather than miles per hour. He was creating, without knowing the formal term for it, a detailed analysis of passive geothermal climate control, the principles that would later be taught in engineering schools and applied to everything from food storage to wine cellars to seed banks were revealing themselves to him through patient observation of what the mountain had already built over millennia of volcanic activity and erosion, and the slow, patient work of water moving through stone. On the 10th day, he walked to the nearest settlement. He had seen smoke from chimneys to the south during his explorations of the area around the cave, and by following the creek downstream for 12 miles he found the source. A small town called Pinewood, barely worthy of the name, consisting of a general store with living quarters above it, a blacksmith shop, a livery stable, and perhaps a dozen houses scattered along the creek. The store served as post office and meeting hall, and the social center of a community that included not just the town itself, but the ranches and homesteads scattered through the surrounding valleys. The storekeeper was a man named Cyrus Wade, perhaps 50 years old, with the careful eyes of someone who had extended credit to too many people who never paid, and had learned to judge character quickly. He looked up from the ledger he was writing in when Elijah entered, and his expression went from neutral to wary in the time it took for him to register the state of Elijah's clothes and the lack of any horse tied outside. "Help you?" Wade asked. "I need supplies." Elijah set his list on the counter: lumber for building, nails, 3 more mercury thermometers if you have them, notebooks, seeds for spring planting. Wade picked up the list and read it slowly. Then he looked at Elijah with the expression of a man trying to solve a puzzle with insufficient pieces. "You got money?" "I have $8. Elijah set the coins on the counter, "and I can work. I will need credit for most of this." "Where are you living?" 12 miles north, in the mountains." Wade's eyebrows rose slightly. "You are the one they told me about. The man living in a cave like some kind of wild animal." "I am living in a cave. I am not a wild animal." The storekeeper studied him for a long moment. "What are you building up there?" "A root cellar." Elijah saw no reason to elaborate. "A very good root cellar." "Why do you need 3 thermometers for a root cellar?" "To measure temperature precisely. Different foods store best at different temperatures. If I am going to do this properly, I need to know exactly what conditions I am creating." Wade tapped the list against the counter. "This will come to about $40 total. You have 8. That leaves $32 of credit I would be extending to a man I do not know, who lives in a cave, who wants thermometers for a root cellar. I will pay you back." "How?" "Work, I can do carpentry, stonework, general labor. 1 day a week until the debt is cleared. You can set the rate. Wade considered this. He looked at the list again, then at Elijah's hands, which were scarred and calloused from 2 weeks of work in the cave and 14 days of walking before that. "The blacksmith needs help," he said finally. "His apprentice left for the gold fields in Idaho and he is behind on work. If you can swing a hammer, you can work off your debt there. 10 hours a week at $1.50 per day. That is 20 weeks to clear $32. Agreed. Wade pulled out a credit ledger and made an entry. Then he began gathering the items from Elijah's list. The lumber he would have to order from the mill 15 miles downriver. It would arrive in 2 weeks. The nails he had. The thermometers he did not have and would need to order from Missoula, which would take a month or more. The notebooks he had, cheap paper but serviceable. The seeds he would not have until spring, but he could order them if Elijah told him what varieties. While Wade assembled the supplies, Elijah asked about the town. How many families lived in the area? What they raised and grew? How they survived winters when the snow piled 6 feet deep and the temperature stayed below zero for weeks at a time? Wade answered the questions with the wary friendliness of a man talking to someone he suspects might be insane, but who has not yet proven it. "People say you are crazy," Wade said as he wrapped the notebooks in brown paper, "living up there alone with winter coming on." "People are entitled to their opinions." "Are you crazy?" Elijah considered the question seriously. "I do not think so. But I suppose a crazy person would not know if they were crazy, so my opinion on the matter is probably not reliable." Wade almost smiled. "That is the sanest thing I have heard you say." Over the following weeks, Elijah established a routine. He worked at the blacksmith's shop every Tuesday, 10 hours of hard labor pumping the bellows and holding iron, while the blacksmith hammered out horseshoes and wagon parts, and the 1,000 metal pieces that a frontier community needed to function. The work was brutal on his shoulders and back, and he returned to the cave each Tuesday evening so tired he could barely eat before falling asleep. But the blacksmith paid in cash at the end of each day, and Wade kept a careful record of the debt declining week by week. The rest of his time he spent at the cave. When the lumber arrived, he began building, not the interior structures yet, but the entrance. The cave opening was adequate for access, but it needed to be sealed against wind and weather while still allowing the natural ventilation that made the system work. He felled timber from the aspen grove above the cave, choosing straight trunks 8 to 10 inches in diameter, small enough for one man to handle, but large enough to hew into beams that would support a proper door frame. Felling timber alone with a single axe was work that tested him in ways that went beyond physical strength. Strength mattered. The first blow of the day and the 100th had to be struck with equal precision, the blade biting into the wood at the exact angle that would send the tree falling in the direction he wanted rather than the direction gravity preferred. But what mattered more than strength was patience. The willingness to make the same motion over and over, to take breaks when his shoulders began to burn and his hands began to slip on the axe handle, to sharpen the blade when it dulled, and to continue when every muscle in his back screamed for him to stop. He dragged the felled trees to the cave entrance using a rope and a system of levers rigged from living trees, using the downward slope of the hillside to do the work that a horse would have done on flat ground. His only tools were the axe, a crosscut saw he had bought on credit from Wade, and a hand auger he had fashioned from a broken wagon spoke, and a piece of hardened steel the blacksmith had given him in trade for an extra hour of work. By early December, he had built a timber frame entrance that sealed the cave opening against wind and animals, while still allowing air to flow through adjustable gaps at the top and bottom. The frame was built from aspen that he had hewn flat on 2 sides, fitted together with mortise and tenon joints that he cut by hand using the saw and a chisel he had made by grinding down an old file. The joints were not perfect. He could see gaps in places where the fit was not as tight as it should have been, and he knew that a master carpenter would have looked at his work and found 100 flaws. But the frame was solid and it served its purpose. He hung a door made from planks split from a lightning-killed pine he had found half a mile from the cave. The door was heavy enough to stay closed against the wind, but not so heavy that he could not open it easily. He fitted it with leather hinges that the blacksmith had made for him in exchange for 2 days of extra work, and he carved a simple latch from a piece of oak. When he stepped back and looked at what he had built, he felt a satisfaction that had nothing to do with perfection and everything to do with function. The entrance looked like it belonged there, like it had grown out of the hillside rather than being imposed upon it. The aspen logs had already begun to weather to a silver gray that blended with the volcanic stone, and within a year or two, he knew, the whole structure would look like it had been there for decades. Through all of this work, the cave kept him alive. Each night he crawled back into that 53-degree chamber, wrapped himself in his wool blanket on a bed of dried pine needles he had gathered and piled 6 inches deep, and slept more soundly than he had ever slept in his father's house. The mountain breathed its warm breath over him, while the temperature outside dropped to 10 degrees, and then to 0 and then lower still. And in the mornings when he emerged into air so cold it hurt his lungs, the cave at his back felt less like a hole in a hillside, and more like a hand held out in welcome, offering warmth that asked nothing in return except that he use it wisely. In January, the thermometers arrived from Missoula. Wade sent word through a rider who was passing near the cave on his way to a ranch in the northern valley, and Elijah walked to Pinewood through snow that was knee-deep in the drifts and ankle-deep on the packed trail. He collected the thermometers, 3 of them wrapped individually in wool and packed in a wooden box with sawdust for padding, and he carried them back to the cave as carefully as if they were made of spun glass. With the thermometers, he began a more systematic study of the cave's temperature gradients. He hung one in the main chamber, one in the secondary chamber, and one in the smallest chamber. He recorded readings 3 times daily and began to see patterns he had only guessed at before. The main chamber, closest to the entrance and most influenced by external conditions, showed a daily variation of 3 degrees, warming slightly in the afternoon when the sun hit the hillside and cooling slightly at night. The secondary chamber varied by only 1 degree. The smallest chamber, deepest in the hillside and most insulated by sheer mass of stone, did not vary at all. It held at 49 degrees Fahrenheit with such precision that Elijah began to wonder if the thermometer was broken. But when he brought it outside, it responded normally to the freezing air. He realized that he had not one root cellar but 3 distinct climate zones within a single cave system. The main chamber at 53 degrees was ideal for potatoes and root vegetables that needed cool but not cold storage. The secondary chamber at 51 degrees was perfect for cabbage and other crops that benefited from slightly cooler conditions. The smallest chamber at 49 degrees was cold enough for apples and other fruits that required temperatures just above freezing to maintain their crispness for months. But having discovered this, he immediately saw the problem. He had no food to store. He had been living on the dried elk meat many horses had given him, supplemented with what small game he could trap and the dwindling supplies he had bought on credit from Wade. Spring was still 3 months away, too far off for planting, and even when spring came he would need to wait through an entire growing season before he had crops to harvest and store. He was building a storage system with nothing to store, testing a theory with no way to prove it, and he was doing it while living on credit and the patience of a storekeeper who probably thought he was insane. On a morning in late January when the temperature outside was 15 below 0 and his breath froze into ice crystals that hung in the air like diamond dust, Elijah sat in the main chamber and took stock of his situation. He had been at the cave for 3 months. He had built an entrance that worked. He had mapped the temperature zones. He had filled 2 notebooks with observations that would mean nothing to anyone unless he could demonstrate that the system actually worked for its intended purpose. And he had no way to demonstrate that purpose until fall. He could wait. Patience was something he had in abundance, but patience without proof would eventually exhaust even Wade's willingness to extend credit, and Elijah knew that the storekeeper's tolerance had limits. He needed to test the cave's storage capability now, not in 9 months when the harvest came in. The next Tuesday, when he walked to Pinewood for his day of work at the blacksmith's shop, he stopped at the general store first. Wade was inventorying canned goods, marking quantities in his ledger with the methodical precision of a man who knew that survival in a place like this depended on accurate records. "I need to buy vegetables," Elijah said. Wade looked up from his counting. "You want to buy vegetables in January?" "Yes." "Why?" "To test my storage system. I need produce that would normally spoil within weeks so I can prove it will last months in the cave." Wade set down his pencil. "You want me to sell you vegetables that I could sell to people who will actually eat them, so you can take them up to your cave and watch them rot." "So I can watch them not rot." The storekeeper studied him for a long moment. "How much are you willing to pay?" "Whatever the going rate is, but I am already in debt to you. This would add to what I owe." Wade walked to the back of the store where he kept the root vegetables he had bought from local farmers in the fall. Potatoes stored in barrels of sand, turnips and carrots wrapped in burlap, onions hung in strings from the ceiling. He looked at the inventory, then back at Elijah. "I will sell you 50 pounds of potatoes, 20 pounds of carrots, 10 pounds of turnips. Cost is $2, but I am going to add a condition to this credit." "What condition?" "If your system works, if those vegetables last through until spring in the same condition they are now, you store my overflow next winter. I always lose 20% or more to rot and freezing. If you can do better than that, I will pay you to store my goods. And if the vegetables spoil, then you still owe me the $2 plus the $30 you already owe me. And I will have learned an expensive lesson about extending credit to crazy people." Elijah held out his hand, agreed. They shook on it, and Wade loaded the vegetables into burlap sacks that Elijah carried back to the cave through snow that was starting to fall again in the large, soft flakes that meant more accumulation by morning. He stored the vegetables according to what he had learned about the temperature zones. The potatoes went in the main chamber, placed on shelves he had carved directly into the stone walls. He had shaped the shelves with a slight backward tilt, so that anything placed on them would lean against the wall rather than slide forward, and he had carved shallow grooves along the back edge of each shelf that allowed air to circulate behind the stored goods rather than trapping moisture against the stone. The carrots he buried in boxes filled with damp sand from the creek bed, placed in the secondary chamber where the cooler temperature would keep them crisp. The turnips went on the upper shelves of that same chamber where the air moved more freely. The onions he hung in the main chamber near the entrance where the lower humidity would dry them to the papery state that allowed them to store for months. Then he began what would become a ritual that would define the next 40 years of his life. He weighed each type of vegetable and recorded the weight in his notebook. He made notes about their condition, which potatoes showed signs of sprouting, which carrots were beginning to soften, which turnips had blemishes. He marked the date and time, and then he waited. He checked the vegetables weekly, making notes about any changes. He weighed them monthly to track moisture loss. He maintained his temperature readings 3 times daily without fail, and slowly, week by week, the pattern emerged. The The potatoes that Wade had expected to start sprouting by February showed no growth at all. The carrots that should have begun to go soft and rubbery by March remained firm and crisp. The turnips held their texture. The onions dried perfectly, their outer skins becoming papery and protective while the inner layers stayed moist enough to be usable. By the end of March, when Elijah walked to Pinewood to show Wade the results, he had lost less than 4 pounds out of the 80 pounds total he had stored, a loss rate of 5%. Wade's own storage cellar, he admitted, had lost 18 pounds out of the same amount during the same period, a loss rate of 22%. The storekeeper stood in the general store examining the potatoes Elijah had brought as proof, turning them over in his hands, testing their firmness with his thumb. "These came out of your cave." "Yes. They look like they were pulled from the ground yesterday." "They were pulled from the ground in October, before I bought them from you in January." Wade set the potato down on the counter and looked at Elijah with an expression that was no longer wary but something closer to respect. "You actually did it." "I observed what the mountain had already built. Then I used it as it wanted to be used." "People in town think you are crazy." "I know. Are you going to prove them wrong?" Elijah considered the question. "I am going to keep doing what I am doing. If that proves them wrong, that is a consequence, not a goal." Wade nodded slowly. "I have a proposition. My storage cellar is inadequate. Every winter I lose 20 to 30% of my root vegetables to rot or freezing. If you can store my overflow at the loss rates you just demonstrated, I will pay you 10% of the value of what you save." Elijah did the mathematics in his head. If Wade was losing 25% and Elijah could reduce that to 5%, that was a savings of 20%. 10% of that savings, paid to Elijah, would give him income for the first time since he had arrived at the cave. "Agreed," he said, "but I need to expand the cave first. I need more space and better organization." Wade held out his hand. "We have a deal, and I am forgiving your current debt. Consider it an investment in a business relationship." They shook hands, and for the first time in 4 months Elijah Cross had something that resembled a future, rather than just a stubborn refusal to give up on an idea that most people thought was foolish. That spring he planted his first garden. The half-acre of bench land below the cave had been sitting fallow for as long as the forest had stood, accumulating soil from the slow erosion of the hillside above, and the endless rain of leaves from the aspens and fir. He dug into it with a spade Wade had lent him, and found 6 to 8 inches of topsoil over fractured volcanic rock. The soil was dark and rich, and smelled of the particular sweetness that only well-aged organic matter produces. Below the topsoil, the fractured rock provided drainage that would prevent the waterlogging that killed root crops in the heavy clay soils of the valley bottoms. He composted aggressively, hauling manure from Wade's stable in burlap sacks in exchange for an extra day of work each month. He supplemented the manure with wood ash from his fire and the cleaned entrails of the rabbits and grouse he hunted. He built 3 compost piles in rotation, turning them weekly with a pitchfork Wade had given him in trade for storing the storekeeper's winter vegetables. He planted in May when the last frost had passed and the soil had warmed enough to germinate seeds: potatoes, turnips, carrots, beets, cabbages, and onions. The staples of northern subsistence farming, crops that would grow in short seasons and cold soil and store well through long winters. But he also planted varieties that other farmers at this elevation would have considered foolish: winter squash that needed a long season, dried beans of 3 varieties that required more heat than Montana usually provided, and a strain of late-season apple he grafted onto wild rootstock he had found in a hollow a mile from the cave. The wild trees were scrubby and produced fruit barely fit for animal feed, hard little apples that never sweetened even after frost. But their roots were magnificently adapted to the thin, rocky soil and the harsh winters, and Elijah reasoned that a cultivated variety grafted onto that wild rootstock might combine the productivity of selective breeding with the hardiness of native adaptation. He made 7 grafts using technique he had learned from a textbook in Colorado. 4 of them took. He would not know if they would actually produce good fruit for 3 years, but the fact that they survived the grafting and began to grow gave him hope. Through the summer he worked his garden and expanded the cave. Using careful blasting techniques he had learned from watching the blacksmith work with explosives to split particularly large boulders, he widened the passages between chambers and began excavating a 4th chamber that would be dedicated to the kind of storage that required the coldest possible temperatures without actual freezing. It was during this excavation in late July that he made a discovery that would transform his understanding of what the cave could be. He was working in the secondary chamber, using a pry bar to remove loose rock from the wall where he planned to widen the passage, when the stone gave way more easily than he expected and revealed not solid rock behind it but a void. He widened the opening carefully, testing each piece of stone before putting his weight on it, and when the hole was large enough to look through, he held a candle into the darkness beyond. The chamber on the other side was natural, untouched by any previous excavation, and it was unlike anything else in the cave system. It was perhaps 15 feet across and 20 feet deep, with a ceiling that rose to a height of 10 feet at its center. But what made it extraordinary was the floor. Water moved across the floor in a thin sheet, flowing from a crack in the far wall and disappearing into a crevice near where Elijah stood. He reached through the opening and dipped his fingers in the water. It was cold. Not cave temperature cold, but genuinely cold, the temperature of water that had recently been in contact with snow or ice. He spent the next 3 days carefully enlarging the opening until he could climb through into the new chamber. What he found there changed everything he thought he knew about the cave's potential. The water flowed from an underground spring that emerged from the rock at the back of the chamber. The spring was fed, he eventually determined, by snowmelt from high on the mountain that percolated down through fractures in the stone and emerged here at a temperature of perhaps 37 degrees. Just above freezing. The water flowed across the floor of the chamber, and the thermal mass of that cold water kept the entire chamber at a temperature far lower than any other part of the cave system. When he hung a thermometer in the chamber and checked it the next morning, it read 42 degrees. He had found a natural refrigeration chamber. Not just cool storage like the other chambers, but genuinely cold storage, cold enough to keep meat fresh for weeks, cold enough to store milk and butter and cheese, cold enough to preserve foods that required temperatures close to freezing. And more than that, the spring water itself could be used, could be diverted and channeled, could be made to flow through carved channels in stone shelves to create even colder microclimates, could be used to wash and clean and provide the moisture needed for certain types of preservation. He spent a week mapping the new chamber and planning how to use it. He carved channels in the stone floor to direct the water flow. He built stone shelves that allowed the cold water to flow beneath them, using the water as a heat sink to keep the air above even cooler. He created a series of pools at different depths, each one slightly different in temperature, each one suitable for a different purpose. By the time he was finished, he had transformed a natural spring chamber into a sophisticated cold storage system that offered temperatures ranging from 38 degrees at the coldest point near the spring outlet to 45 degrees at the warmest point near the entrance passage. He now had not 3 temperature zones but 5, 42 degrees in the spring chamber, 49 degrees in the original small chamber, 51 degrees in the secondary chamber, 53 degrees in the main chamber, and 55 degrees near the entrance where the external air had the most influence. 5 different climates within a single cave system, each one stable, each one maintained by nothing more than the thermal mass of stone, and the patient flow of water and air that had been moving through this hillside for millennia before he arrived, and would continue moving for millennia after he was gone. When he showed the spring chamber to Wade in August, the storekeeper stood in the cold air flowing from the underground water and shook his head slowly. You could store meat in here, fresh meat, through the entire summer if you wanted to. I could store anything that needs to be kept cold. Wade looked at the stone shelves, at the channels of water flowing beneath them, at the thermometer reading 42 degrees, while outside the August heat had pushed the temperature to 85. This is not a root cellar anymore. No, Elijah said, it is something better. That fall he harvested his garden, and the results exceeded every hope he had allowed himself to harbor. The potatoes were abundant and healthy, yielding 3 times what he had planted. The carrots were long and straight and sweet. The turnips and beets were firm and flavorful. The cabbages had grown to the size of a man's head, dense and heavy and perfect for storage. He stored everything in the cave, using the knowledge he had gained over months of observation and experimentation. Potatoes in the main chamber, carrots in damp sand in the secondary chamber, cabbage hung upside down from ceiling beams in the small chamber, beets and turnips on stone shelves in the spring chamber where the cold water kept them crisp. And through the fall and winter of 1880 into the spring of 1881, he monitored it all. He weighed and measured and recorded. He tracked losses by variety and by storage location and by method. He noted which shelves performed better than others. Lower shelves where humidity collected were better for root vegetables. Higher shelves where air moved more freely were better for cabbage and squash. Shelves near the spring water were best for produce that benefited from the additional cold and moisture. He filled 3 notebooks that winter with observations that represented what might have been the most detailed empirical study of underground food storage conducted anywhere in the American territories at that time, and the data showed what he had hoped it would show. His losses, calculated at the end of the storage season in April 1881, were 7%. Wade's losses in his conventional cellar during the same period were 32%. 7% against 32%. The difference between a system built through patient observation and a system built through tradition and guesswork. The difference between understanding what the mountain offered and trying to impose human will upon it. Word began to spread. A farmer from the next valley rode 20 miles to see the cave after Wade mentioned it. A rancher from south of Pinewood came to ask if Elijah could store beef through the summer. A woman from town wanted to know if butter would keep. Elijah showed them all the same thing: the chambers, the temperature gradients, the careful observation that had gone into understanding how the system worked, and he told them all the same thing. I did not build this. I observed what was already here and used it as it wanted to be used. You could do the same if you found the right location and had the patience to understand it before trying to change it. Some of them understood. Most did not. But all of them left with the knowledge that a man living in a cave 12 miles north of Pinewood had solved a problem that had plagued mountain communities since the first settlers had arrived. The problem of keeping food fresh through seasons when fresh food should not exist. And in solving that problem, Elijah Cross had begun to build something that his family had told him was impossible. A life based not on ownership of land or control of resources, but on understanding of principles and patient application of knowledge. The mountain had given him a gift. He had honored that gift by refusing to exploit it and choosing instead to understand it. And now, that understanding was becoming something more valuable than any amount of silver hidden in sealed chambers. It was becoming a legacy. By the spring of 1881, Elijah Cross had expanded the cave system to 800 square feet across 4 connected chambers, each one calibrated to a specific temperature range, each one serving a different purpose in the careful choreography of food preservation that he had spent 18 months perfecting. The main chamber at 53 degrees held root vegetables that needed cool but not cold storage. The secondary chamber at 51 degrees housed cabbage and squash, and the dense winter vegetables that benefited from slightly cooler air. The small chamber at 49 degrees, where his grandfather's bones still rested behind their wall of carefully arranged stone, stored apples and other fruits that required temperatures just above freezing. And the spring chamber, discovered in late summer of 1880 with its constant flow of cold water across the stone floor, kept meat and dairy, and anything that needed genuine cold to stay fresh at 42 degrees. He had built stone shelves in all 4 chambers, carving them directly into the volcanic rock, with a patience that would have seemed obsessive to anyone watching, but which he understood as necessary. Each shelf angled backward slightly, so that stored goods leaned against the wall rather than sliding forward. Each shelf had a groove carved along its back edge to allow air circulation. Each shelf was positioned at a specific height to take advantage of the natural temperature stratification that occurred in still air, warmer near the ceiling and cooler near the floor. The entrance he had rebuilt twice, each iteration an improvement on the last, until he had a timber frame that sealed against weather while allowing the precise amount of airflow needed to maintain the circulation that kept the cave from going stale. He had learned to adjust the ventilation by opening or closing wooden dampers he had fitted to both the main entrance and the upper fissure that served as the system's chimney. In winter, he kept the upper fissure partially closed to retain warmth. In summer, he opened it fully to draw cool air from the depths of the cave upward and out, creating a natural cooling effect that kept the interior below 60 degrees, even when the outside temperature climbed into the 80s. The garden above the cave had grown from half an acre to a full acre, terraced into 3 levels that followed the natural bench of land below the aspen grove. He had spent the previous fall and winter hauling stone from the creek bed to build retaining walls that held the soil in place and created the flat planting surfaces he needed. The work had been brutal, carrying stones that weighed 30 or 40 pounds up a slope that left him gasping for breath, fitting them together into walls that would hold against spring runoff and summer storms. But the result was 3 terraces that caught the southern sun and drained perfectly, and allowed him to triple his planting area without fighting the slope. He had also built a small cabin on the flat ground just above the cave entrance, a single-room structure of hewn logs with a stone chimney and a plank floor. The cabin was simple, barely large enough for a bed and a table and a chair, and the small iron stove that Wade had sold him at cost after seeing that Elijah was serious about staying through the winter. But it was weather-tight, and it had a south-facing window that let in light during the short winter days, and it served as living quarters while the cave below remained dedicated to storage and work. In late March of 1881, as the snow was beginning to melt from the south-facing slopes and the first green shoots of early spring plants were pushing through the leaf litter, Elijah's older brother Garrett arrived at the cave. Elijah was working in the garden, turning over the soil in preparation for planting, when he heard a horse on the trail below. He straightened and watched as the rider came into view, and even at a distance he recognized his brother's silhouette, the broad shoulders and the way Garrett sat a horse like he had been born in the saddle. Garrett rode up to the cabin and dismounted. He was thinner than Elijah remembered, and there was a tightness around his eyes that spoke of strain and sleepless nights. He stood looking at the cabin, at the garden terraces, at the timber entrance to the cave, taking it all in with the careful assessment of a man who had spent his life evaluating the value of things. Elijah walked down from the garden terrace, the shovel still in his hand. Neither brother spoke until they were standing 10 feet apart, close enough to see the changes that 2 years had written on each other's faces. Garrett broke the silence first. I heard you were living up here, thought I should see for myself what you were doing. Now you see it. Garrett gestured at the terraces, at the cabin, at the cave entrance. This is what you chose over the ranch. This is what I built after the ranch was chosen for me. Garrett nodded slowly. He looked older than 39 years should have made him. There were lines in his face that had not been there at their father's funeral, and his hands, when he took off his riding gloves, showed calluses that had cracked and bled and healed into scars. We had a hard winter, Garrett said. Lost 40 head of cattle in a blizzard in January. They drifted into a box canyon and froze before we could get to them. I am sorry to hear that. Could have been worse. Could have lost the whole herd if we had not found them when we did. We butchered what we could save, but there was too much meat. My cold storage, the one Pa built 20 years ago, it is not adequate. I lost 800 pounds of beef to spoilage. At current prices, that is $300 gone to rot. Elijah said nothing. He waited. Garrett had not ridden 12 miles to tell him about business losses unless there was something more coming. Garrett looked at the cave entrance. I heard you are storing food up here. Heard from Wade and some of the other merchants that you keep vegetables fresh longer than anyone has managed. Heard your loss rates are a fraction of what everyone else accepts as normal. That is accurate. I need storage. I have 1,200 pounds of beef that I need to keep from spoiling. I will pay you whatever your rate is. Elijah studied his brother for a long moment. The last time they had spoken, Garrett had told him to find his rocks and never come back, had watched him walk away with everything he owned in a canvas rucksack, and had not said a word to stop him. And now he stood here asking for help, and the asking clearly cost him something in pride, even if he would never admit it. I do not charge family, Elijah said. Garrett's eyes narrowed. What? You are my brother. The cave does not charge family. Bring your beef, I will store it. I can pay. I know you can. I am choosing not to accept payment. Why? Because the cave does not hold grudges, and neither do I. Garrett looked at him for a long moment, and something shifted in his expression, some tension that had been there since he arrived easing fractionally. I wronged you. At the will reading. I stood there and watched Pa cut you out, and I laughed about it. You did. I thought you were a fool for studying rocks instead of learning ranch work. Thought Pa was right to leave you nothing. Elijah leaned on his shovel, and now. Garrett gestured at the terraces, at the cave entrance, at the carefully built structures that showed evidence of planning and skill and patient work. Now I think maybe the fool was me. You built something up here, something that works, and I'm standing here asking you to save beef I could not keep fresh on my own. You are not a fool. You were doing what you were taught to do, but what we were taught is not the only way to do things. Garrett nodded slowly. Can I see it, the cave? Elijah led his brother through the timber entrance and into the main chamber. He lit the lantern that hung by the door and held it high so the light reached into the corners of the space. Garrett stood in the center of the chamber, turning slowly, looking at the stone shelves carved into the walls, at the drainage channels cut into the floor, at the thermometer hanging from a ceiling beam showing 53 degrees while outside the temperature was barely 40. This is not a root cellar, Garrett said. This is something else entirely. Elijah took him through all 4 chambers, explaining the temperature gradients, the ventilation system, the way the cold spring in the 4th chamber created a natural refrigeration effect. He showed him the notebooks where he had recorded 2 years of temperature readings and storage results. He explained the principles of thermal mass and geothermal stability, and the way the Earth itself could be used as a climate control system that required no fuel and no maintenance beyond careful observation. Garrett listened to all of it without interrupting. When they emerged back into daylight, he stood blinking in the sun for a moment, then looked at his younger brother with an expression that might have been respect or might have been something closer to awe. "How did you learn to do this?" "Grandfather's journal. It pointed me here. And then I observed what the mountain had already built and used it as it wanted to be used." Pa always said observation was just an excuse for not working. Elijah smiled faintly. Observation is the hardest work there is. It requires you to be patient enough to see what is actually there instead of what you want to be there. Garrett returned the next week with his beef, 1,200 pounds of it packed in barrels with salt. Elijah stored it in the spring chamber where the cold water kept the temperature at 42 degrees, and over the following months, he showed his brother how to rotate the stock and monitor for spoilage, and adjust the storage conditions based on what the meat itself was telling him through subtle changes in color and smell and texture. By summer, when beef stored in conventional cellars would have been long since ruined, Garrett's meat was still good. Not quite fresh, the salt curing had seen to that, but preserved in a state that allowed it to be sold or eaten without any risk. In August, when he came to retrieve the last of it, Garrett stood in the spring chamber and shook his head. "I lost less than 2%. 2% against the 40% I expected to lose." Elijah made a note in his record book. "That is what proper storage does." "How much do I owe you?" "Nothing, I told you. Family does not pay." Garrett was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that surprised them both. Teach me how to do this. I want to build one on my own land." Over the following months, Garrett became a student of the cave. He rode up from the ranch every week, sometimes staying for several days, learning the principles that govern geothermal storage. Elijah taught him how to read stone, how to identify stable strata versus fractured layers that would not support excavation. He taught him about airflow and ventilation, and the chimney effect that drove natural circulation. He taught him about temperature gradients and humidity control, and the 1,000 small details that made the difference between a hole in the ground and a functional storage system. It was during one of these teaching sessions in August of 1881 that a woman arrived at the cave. Elijah was in the main chamber with Garrett, explaining the positioning of storage shelves relative to airflow patterns, when he heard a voice calling from outside. A woman's voice, speaking with an accent that marked her as foreign-born, though he could not place the region. He emerged from the cave to find a woman standing near the garden terraces, examining his bean plants with the focused attention of someone who understood what they were looking at. She was perhaps 26 or 27 years old, small in stature, but with a presence that made her seem taller than she was. She wore a dark dress that showed the wear of travel and work, and her hair was pulled back in a practical bun that suggested she had not come here for social calling. "Your beans are planted too close together," she said without preamble. "They will shade each other out by midsummer. You want 8 inches between plants, not 6. Elijah looked at the beans. She was right. He had noticed the shading problem himself in July and had planned to adjust the spacing next season. But he had not expected to hear his own observation spoken aloud by a stranger who had appeared at his garden without introduction. "I am Margaret Lindgren," the woman said. I read about your cave in a letter that Dr. Whitmore sent to the Agricultural Journal in Missoula. I came to see if what he wrote was true. Which part did you want to verify? The part about stable temperature storage, allowing for extended preservation of perishable goods. I preserve fish using Norwegian methods, and I need better temperature control than I can achieve in conventional cellars. Elijah gestured toward the cave entrance. I can show you. He took her through the 4 chambers, explaining the same principles he had been teaching Garrett. But where his brother had asked questions about the practical mechanics of excavation and construction, Margaret asked questions about chemistry and preservation, and the specific temperature and humidity requirements of different types of fermentation. When they reached the spring chamber, she knelt by the water flowing across the floor and dipped her fingers in it, testing the temperature with the practiced touch of someone who had spent years working with precise conditions. 42 degrees, she said. Maybe 43. This is ideal for certain types of preservation work I have been trying to perfect. What kind of preservation? Fish, primarily. My family has been preserving fish for 3 generations in Norway. We use methods that require very specific temperature ranges. This chamber would allow me to experiment with techniques I cannot attempt in conventional storage. She stood and looked around the space, at the stone shelves, at the channels of water, at the thermometer showing 42 degrees. Then she looked at Elijah with eyes that were direct and assessing in a way that reminded him of how Wade had first looked at him, judging whether he was a capable man or a fool living in a cave. I run a boarding house in Pinewood, she said. My husband died in a mining accident 2 years ago and left me with a daughter to raise and no income except what I can earn. I preserve fish and sell it to merchants and individual customers. Your cave could extend my inventory significantly. I would be willing to pay 20% of my gross sales for storage rights. Elijah considered this. He had been storing goods for Wade on a percentage basis, and the arrangement had worked well for both of them. But this was different. This was a woman he did not know, asking to store goods that required specific conditions he had not tested, offering terms that would tie them together in a business relationship that could become complicated. Keep your percentage, he said. Teach me your preservation methods instead. Margaret's eyebrows rose slightly. You want knowledge instead of money. Knowledge compounds, money spends. She smiled for the first time since arriving, a quick expression that changed her face from serious to almost beautiful. You are an unusual man, Mr. Cross. So I have been told. Over the following weeks, Margaret brought her equipment to the cave and began teaching Elijah the Norwegian methods of fish preservation that her family had practiced for generations. She taught him about fermentation chemistry, about the role of beneficial bacteria in creating the complex flavors and extended shelf life that made properly fermented food superior to simple salt curing. She taught him about how to test conditions using simple indicators. She taught him about the temperature ranges that promoted the right kinds of bacterial growth while inhibiting the dangerous kinds. In return, Elijah provided her with temperature-controlled storage space and helped her experiment with different preservation methods in different chambers. They discovered that the secondary chamber at 51 degrees worked well for certain fermentation processes. They discovered that the high humidity in the innermost chambers prevented the surface drying that ruined some types of preserved fish. They discovered that careful control of airflow could be used to regulate the speed of fermentation, allowing Margaret to produce batches with different characteristics for different customers. Margaret's daughter Astrid, 7 years old and curious in the way of children who have learned early that the world requires close attention, often came with her mother to the cave. She would sit in the main chamber with a book or a slate and do her lessons while her mother worked, And sometimes she would ask Elijah questions about the stones, or the temperature readings, or why the water in the spring chamber was colder than the water in the creek outside. He answered her questions with the same seriousness he would have given an adult inquiry, and he was struck by how quickly she learned, how she remembered details from one visit to the next and built on them in her understanding. She reminded him of himself at that age, always asking why, always wanting to understand the mechanisms beneath the surface of things. Through the late summer and fall of 1881, a pattern established itself. Garrett came weekly to continue learning about geothermal storage, often staying to help with the heavy work of expanding the cave or maintaining the garden. Margaret came several times a week to tend to her preservation work and experiment with different techniques. Wade sent a steady stream of vegetables and occasional meat to be stored, paying Elijah a percentage of what he saved through reduced spoilage. By November, Elijah had 3 notebooks full of data on various preservation methods, a 4th notebook dedicated to the engineering principles Garrett was learning, and a 5th notebook that tracked the financial arrangements with his various clients. He had also begun to accumulate something he had not expected and did not quite know what to do with: a reputation. Farmers and ranchers from valleys he had never visited began arriving at the cave, asking questions about how he achieved his storage results, wanting to know if they could pay him to store their goods or if he could teach them to build similar systems on their own land. He turned away the ones who wanted him to do the work for them. He taught freely the ones who wanted to learn to do it themselves. And slowly, through the accumulation of individual conversations and demonstrated results, people began to speak of him differently. They no longer called him the mole, at least not to his face. They called him the man with the cave, or the Norwegian's partner, or occasionally, from the ones who had worked with him long enough to see past the strangeness of living in the mountains, simply Elijah. The winter of 1881 to 1882 came early and stayed late. The first snow fell in October, weeks before anyone expected it, and by November the passes were already closed. The temperatures dropped to 20 below zero in December and stayed there for 2 weeks. Ranchers who had not yet moved their cattle to winter pastures lost animals to the cold. Gardens that had not been fully harvested froze in the ground. But the cave kept its steady warmth, and the food stored in its chambers stayed fresh. And Elijah spent the long, dark evenings in his cabin reading by lamplight and making notes about what he would plant in the spring, and how he would expand the cave system to handle the increased demand for storage space. It was in the spring of 1882, when the snow was melting and the first warmth of the year was loosening the frozen ground, that Margaret asked him a question that changed the shape of his future. They were in the spring chamber, checking on preservation work that Margaret had started in January. She was making notes in her own record book, recording the results so she could replicate them in future batches. "Why did you refuse to fight for your inheritance?" she asked suddenly, not looking up from her writing. Elijah, who had been adjusting the flow of water in one of the channels, straightened. "What made you think of that?" "I heard the story. Everyone in Pinewood knows it. Your father left you nothing and your brothers got everything and you walked away instead of contesting the will." "That is accurate." "But why? The law would have supported you. You had education and competence that your brothers lacked. A court would have at least given you a share." Elijah was quiet for a moment, considering how to answer. "Because fighting would have won me land but lost me the lesson." "What lesson?" "That what my family rejected is what the world needed. If I had stayed and fought for the ranch, I would have won some acres and spent the rest of my life trying to prove I deserved them. I would have been looking backward at what I lost instead of forward at what I could build." Margaret set down her pen and looked at him directly. "That is either very wise or very foolish. I have not decided which. Perhaps it is both. She smiled. My husband died in a mine collapse. We had been married 3 years. I was pregnant with Astrid when it happened. The mining company gave me $50 and told me I was lucky to get that much since my husband had signed a contract that absolved them of responsibility for accidents. I am sorry. I could have fought. There were lawyers in Missoula who would have taken the case. But fighting would have taken years and cost money I did not have, and in the end I probably would have lost because the contracts were legal even if they were immoral. So I took the $50 and I learned to preserve fish, and I built a business that has supported my daughter and me for 7 years. You made the same choice I did, to build rather than fight. Yes, but some days I wonder if I was wise, or if I was just too tired to do what justice demanded. Elijah thought about this. Justice is what courts decide. Wisdom is what survives after the courts have forgotten your case. You built something that survives. That is wisdom. Margaret held his gaze for a moment longer, then returned to her notes. I am glad I came here, she said quietly. Not just for the storage. For this. For meeting someone who understands that building matters more than being right. Through the summer of 1882, the relationship between Elijah and Margaret deepened in the way that relationships deepen between competent people working toward shared goals. It was not romantic, not in any way that either of them would have recognized or acknowledged at the time. It was built on respect for each other's knowledge, on the satisfaction of solving problems together, on the quiet pleasure of finding someone who approached the world with the same combination of curiosity and precision that shaped their own thinking. Astrid grew comfortable at the cave. She learned to read the thermometers and record the temperatures in Elijah's notebooks. She learned the names of the different chambers and what each one was used for. She learned about preservation chemistry and geothermal storage, and the patient observation that made both possible. In June of 1882, Margaret's father Olav Lindgren arrived from Norway. He was 61 years old, a master stonemason who had spent 40 years building railroad tunnels through the Norwegian mountains. He had come to America because Margaret was the only family he had left, and he was too old to work the tunnels anymore, and he wanted to spend his remaining years near his granddaughter. Elijah took him into the cave and showed him the chambers and the stone shelves and the careful joinery of the timber entrance frame. Olav examined it all with the critical eye of a man who had spent his life judging whether stone would hold and whether human construction would endure. When they emerged back into daylight, he looked at Elijah with an expression that was both approving and slightly disappointed. Good work, he said in heavily accented English, but the joints could be tighter, the shelves could be more precise. The entrance frame, it is adequate but not excellent. I built it alone with limited tools. I understand. But alone and limited tools is no excuse for accepting adequate when excellent is possible. If you will accept teaching, I will show you how to work stone properly. Over the following months, Olav taught Elijah the stonemason's art. They rebuilt the entrance frame using techniques Olav had learned in Norway, mortise and tenon joinery so precise that Elijah could not fit a knife blade into the seams. They recarved some of the stone shelves to tolerances measured in 1/16 of an inch rather than quarters. They installed support arches in the chambers where Olav's practiced eye detected subtle instabilities that Elijah had missed. The old stonemason worked with the focused intensity of a man who knew his time was limited and wanted to pass on everything he knew before that time ran out. He taught Elijah not just technique, but philosophy. How to read stone and understand what it wanted to do rather than forcing it to do what you wanted. How to build structures that worked with the natural stresses in rock rather than against them. How to create joints that would grow tighter over time, as the wood seasoned rather than looser. When they finished rebuilding the entrance in September of 1882, Olaf stood back and examined the frame with a critical eye. Then he nodded once, a single sharp gesture of satisfaction. "Now it will last," he said. "Now it will stand for your grandchildren." The winter of 1882 to 1883 began with troubling signs that most people in Pinewood were too distracted by their own preparations to notice. The late summer had been unusually dry. The fall rains that normally soaked the ground and filled the creeks had been sparse and irregular. By October, the streams were running lower than anyone could remember for that time of year. The ranchers who relied on those streams to water their cattle through winter began to worry. Then the snow came. Not the heavy, wet snow that built up a snowpack in the mountains and provided melt water through spring and summer, but dry, powdery snow that blew across the frozen ground and accumulated in drifts but held almost no moisture. By December, the snow was 3 feet deep in places, but when it melted in the spring, there would be little water to show for it. The farmers and ranchers who had crops stored in conventional root cellars discovered another problem. The dry air of that strange winter was pulling moisture out of their stored vegetables faster than usual. Potatoes that should have stayed firm until March were shriveling by January. Turnips and beets were losing weight and texture. The onions that normally dried to a papery protective covering were drying so thoroughly they were becoming unusable. By January, food was becoming scarce. Not desperately so, not yet, but the trajectory was clear to anyone who was paying attention. The stored crops were not lasting as long as they should. The cattle were struggling to find enough forage because the dry conditions had limited the grass growth. The price of food in Wade's general store began to climb as supply tightened. Elijah watched all of this from his hillside and made careful notes in his records. The cave's internal humidity remained at 90% regardless of the dry air outside. The vegetables he had stored in October were still firm and fresh in January. His loss rates were running even lower than usual, below 4%, because the stable conditions inside the cave were insulated from the drought that was affecting everything above ground. In early February, Garrett rode up to the cave through snow that was knee-deep and temperatures that had not risen above zero for a week. His face was drawn with worry and exhaustion. "It is bad," he said without preamble when Elijah opened the cabin door. "Worse than I thought it would be. We are going to run out of feed for the cattle by the end of March. Half the ranchers in the valley are in the same situation. And the people in town, the ones who do not have ranches or farms, they are already running short on food. Wade's store is selling what should be February inventory in early February because people's home storage is failing." How many people are affected? In Pinewood and the surrounding valleys, maybe 200 families. Some of them have enough to last if they are careful. But the ones who relied on their root cellars, the ones who did not prepare for a dry winter, they are going to be in trouble by March. Elijah was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "How much do I have stored?" Garrett looked at him steadily. "Enough for your needs through next fall if you keep planting and harvesting as you have been. Maybe enough for twice your needs." Elijah walked to the window and looked down at the cave entrance. At the timber frame Olaf had built to last for generations. At the hillside that held chambers full of food that people desperately needed. He thought about his grandfather's choice to preserve rather than extract, to build rather than profit. He thought about what legacy actually meant. "We open the cave," he said. "What?" "To anyone who needs food. We open it and we tell people they can come and take what they need." Garrett stared at him. "That is your security, your surplus. If you give it away and next year's harvest fails, you will have nothing. If people starve this winter, there will not be a community here to have a harvest next year. You cannot feed 200 families. I can try, and maybe it will be enough." They began distributing food on February 10th, 1883. Elijah and Garrett spread word through Pinewood and the surrounding valleys that anyone who needed food could come to the cave and receive it. No ledger, no debts, no questions asked about who deserved help and who did not. At first, only a few families came, the ones who were most desperate or most willing to accept what they saw as charity. But as word spread that the food was truly free, and that the man offering it was not keeping track of who owed him what, more people came. Margaret organized the distribution with the same methodical precision she brought to her preservation work. She kept count of who came and how much they took, not for purposes of later collection, but so they could track whether they were reaching the people who needed help most. She discovered that some families were too proud to come themselves and began making deliveries to those households, riding down to Pinewood with sacks of potatoes and turnips loaded on a horse that Elijah had bought specifically for the purpose. Astrid, 8 years old and already understanding more about what was happening than many adults would have grasped, helped her mother weigh and package food. She watched as people came to the cave who had previously called her stepfather to be names or spread rumors about the crazy man living in the mountains. She watched as those same people accepted food from him without being made to feel ashamed, without being lectured about their own poor planning, without being told they owed him anything except perhaps to help someone else if they ever had the opportunity. One family that came in early March had walked 2 days from a valley to the west. The father was gaunt and exhausted. The mother carried an infant that was too quiet and too still. They had 3 other children, all of them thin in the way that children become thin when the body starts consuming itself, because there is not enough food coming in. Garrett, who had taken to spending most of his time at the cave during the distribution, took one look at the family and loaded them down with enough food to last 2 weeks, far more than Elijah's standard ration. When the family had left, Garrett stood in the cave entrance and looked at his younger brother. "Their name is Kessler," he said. "I know the father slightly. Good man, hard worker. Their stored crops froze in January when their root cellar flooded and then froze. They lost everything." Elijah made a note in his distribution record. 2 weeks of food will help, but they need seed for spring planting or they will be in the same situation next winter. "I will take them seed," Garrett said, "and I will help them find better land than what they are trying to work now. There is a section near my ranch that is not being used. Good soil, better drainage." The Kesslers did not return to their valley. They stayed, found land through Garrett's help, and built a life that their children would inherit. 30 years later, their grandchildren would still be using the cave for storage and telling the story of how their family had been saved by a man who gave food away when he could have sold it. By the time the distribution ended in late April of 1883, as the snow finally began to melt and the first green shoots of spring appeared on the south-facing slopes, Elijah and Margaret had fed 181 people through the hardest winter most of them had ever experienced. The cave that had started with enough food for one man's needs and a small surplus for teaching and experimentation had kept an entire community from genuine hunger. Elijah's final inventory showed that he had distributed roughly 70% of his stored goods. His loss rate from spoilage during the distribution period had been under 3%, far better than the food would have fared in the hands of people with inadequate storage. The remaining 30% was enough to keep him and Margaret and Astrid and Olav fed until the fall harvest, assuming the summer crops grew as expected. It was the right amount, Margaret said when they finished the final count, as if the cave knew how much was needed and how much to hold back. Elijah looked at the nearly empty shelves and the channels where water still flowed and the thermometer that still read 52 degrees just as it had every day for 4 years. The cave did not know anything, but the patience that built it knew, the observation that shaped it knew, and the choice to preserve rather than extract, to serve rather than profit, that choice knew exactly what it was doing. No one called him the mole after that winter. The ones who had mocked him were the ones he had fed. The ones who had spread rumors were the ones whose children he had kept from going hungry. He had proven something that could not be argued with, could not be dismissed, could not be explained away by people who wanted to believe that practical knowledge and patient observation were less valuable than inherited land or accumulated wealth. He had proven that a man who built something that worked could change outcomes that everyone else accepted as inevitable, that a cave carved by hand could defeat a drought that ruined conventional storage. That knowledge freely shared was worth more than money carefully hoarded. That his grandfather's choice, made 40 years earlier in a chamber sealed with stone, had been exactly right about what mattered and what would last. The next time the territorial governor visited Pinewood, in the summer of 1883, he came specifically to meet the man who had fed the valley through the hungry winter. He found Elijah in the garden above the cave, planting the fall crop that would replenish what had been given away. The governor offered him $2,000 to build a storage facility at Fort Missoula, and another $1,000 to train Army engineers in his methods. Elijah refused the money but agreed to train the engineers. And when the governor asked why he would turn down $3,000, Elijah gave the same answer he had given every other time someone tried to pay him for knowledge that should be free. I am not a contractor, I am a teacher, and the cave is not mine to sell. It belongs to anyone willing to learn from it. The refusal became a story that spread across the territory. The man who turned down a fortune to keep his freedom. The man who fed his neighbors and refused payment. The man who chose legacy over wealth and proved the choice was right by continuing to live exactly as he had before, in a one-room cabin above a cave that held no silver and generated no profit, but which had saved 181 people from a winter that would have broken them. That story, told and retold, carried his name and his principles across Montana and beyond, teaching lessons about what actually mattered to people who were ready to hear them. And every person who heard the story and came to learn from the cave added to the proof that his grandfather had been right all along. Some things, once preserved properly, last forever. The expansion of the cave that Elijah and Olav undertook in the spring of 1883 was not driven by ambition or the desire for greater capacity, but by the simple recognition that knowledge applied properly generates its own momentum. Word of the cave's success had spread through the mining districts and ranching valleys of western Montana, carried by the farmers who had seen their storage losses drop from 30% to 5%, by the merchants who no longer had to accept spoilage as an inevitable cost of doing business, by the people who had been fed through the hungry winter of 1882 to 1883, and who told the story to anyone who would listen. By April of 1883, Elijah was storing goods for 17 different clients. Wade's overflow from the general store, Margaret's preserved fish and fermented vegetables, 3 ranchers who brought beef and pork in the late fall and retrieved it in the spring with losses so minimal they seemed impossible to men who had spent their lives accepting that half of what you stored would be lost. A dairy farmer from the Southern Valley who had discovered that butter kept in the spring chamber at 42 degrees stayed sweet for 6 months. A woman from Pinewood who made cheese using a recipe her grandmother had brought from Switzerland, and who found that the constant temperature and high humidity of the innermost chamber created aging conditions she could not replicate anywhere else. The cave had become more than a personal project or even a successful business venture. It had become a proving ground for the idea that observation and understanding could triumph over tradition and guesswork. And that idea, once proven, demanded to be shared. Olav understood this in a way that surprised Elijah. The old stonemason had spent 40 years building tunnels through Norwegian mountains, following plans drawn by engineers who had never touched stone themselves, cutting passages that served purposes defined by men in offices far from the work sites. He had learned early that the best tunnels were the ones where the engineers listened to the stone workers rather than the other way around, where knowledge flowed upward from the men who actually touched the rock, instead of downward from the men who only drew pictures of it. "We expand not to hold more goods," Olav said one morning as they stood looking at the cave entrance in the slanted light of early spring. "We expand to teach more completely. A man can understand principles from lecture, but a man who helps dig the chamber understands principles from his bones. So we build a teaching chamber. We build a chamber wrong first, then we build it right, and in between, everyone who helps learns what works and what does not work and why." Over the following months they excavated a fifth chamber, and they did it as Olav suggested, deliberately making mistakes that could be corrected, showing the students who came to help what happened when you ignored the grain of the stone or failed to account for water seepage or built without adequate ventilation. They would excavate a section, then stop and evaluate what they had done, identify the errors, and explain how to fix them. Then they would correct the mistakes and move forward, the chamber growing not in a straight, efficient line, but in a series of corrections and improvements that taught far more than perfect execution would have taught. Garrett was there for most of this work, riding up from his ranch twice a week to spend full days swinging a pickaxe and hauling stone, and learning the difference between forcing rock to do what you wanted and encouraging it to do what it was willing to do. His hands, already calloused from ranch work, developed new calluses in different places, the marks of tools he had never used for purposes he had never considered. He was 41 years old and learning a trade as if he were a boy again, and Elijah could see that the learning was changing him in ways that went beyond the acquisition of technique. One evening in June, after a long day of excavation, Garrett sat on a log outside the cave entrance and looked at his younger brother with an expression that was part exhaustion and part something that might have been peace. "I spent 20 years thinking I knew what work was," Garrett said. "Cattle and horses and fence line and all the things Pa taught me. Thought that was the only real work there was. It is real work. But it is not the only real work. This, what you do here, this is something else. This is building something that will outlast us. The ranch, when I die it goes to someone else and they run it or they do not, and eventually it is just land again. But this, what you have built here, this is knowledge. Knowledge does not die when the man who discovered it dies." Elijah was quiet for a moment, watching the sun drop behind the western peaks and turn the sky the color of forge-heated iron. That is what grandfather understood. That is why he sealed the silver and left the map instead. Garrett nodded slowly. "I used to think he was a fool too. Thought Pa was right to focus on the ranch and forget about surveying and measuring and all the things that did not put food on the table directly. But Pa is dead and the ranch is struggling, and you are up here teaching half the territory how to keep food from spoiling. Makes a man reconsider what foolishness actually is." Through that summer, Elijah taught more than 60 people the principles of geothermal storage. Some came for a day, saw the cave, asked their questions, and left with enough understanding to attempt their own excavations. Others stayed for weeks, working alongside Olav and Garrett and Elijah himself, learning not just what to do but why to do it, absorbing the philosophy that observation must precede action and that the land will teach you if you are patient enough to listen. Margaret came frequently during this period, though less to learn about excavation than to experiment with the preservation techniques that the cave's precise temperature control made possible. She had begun to document her methods in the same systematic way that Elijah documented his temperature readings, creating a record of fermentation times and conditions and flavor development that would eventually become one of the most complete records of traditional Norwegian food preservation techniques in America. Her daughter Astrid, now 9 years old, had appointed herself the keeper of the master temperature log. Every morning at dawn and every evening at dusk, she would make the rounds of all 5 chambers with a notebook and pencil, recording the reading from each thermometer with a precision that would have done credit to a university researcher. She had learned to spot patterns in the data that even Elijah sometimes missed, noticing that the temperature in the spring chamber dropped by half a degree every time there was significant snowmelt high on the mountain, or that the main chamber warmed slightly on days when the sun hit the hillside at a particular angle in late afternoon. "You have trained her well," Olav said one evening, watching his granddaughter complete her rounds with the focused seriousness of someone performing a sacred duty. "She sees what is there instead of what she expects to be there. That is the beginning of all real knowledge." I did not train her, I just let her observe. That is what training is, when it is done correctly. In August of 1883, a professor from the newly established University of Montana in Missoula arrived at the cave. His name was Edwin Marsh, 43 years old, trained in geology at Harvard, and recently appointed to establish the university's Department of Natural Sciences. He had heard about the cave from the territorial governor's engineers, and he came with instruments more precise than anything Elijah had ever seen. Thermometers that measured to tenths of a degree, barometers that tracked air pressure changes, hydrometers that tested humidity with scientific accuracy. Marsh spent a week at the cave, taking measurements with his instruments and comparing them to the records that Elijah had been keeping with his simple mercury thermometers and his observations of damp versus dry conditions. At the end of the week, he sat in the main chamber and went through his data with the careful attention of a man who has discovered something he did not expect to find. "Your measurements are accurate," Marsh said, looking up from his notebook. "I brought instruments that cost more than most men earn in a year, and they confirm what you have been recording with equipment that would be considered obsolete by any university standard. The innermost chamber maintains a temperature of 49.3 degrees Fahrenheit with an annual variation of less than 1 degree. The humidity holds between 88 and 92%. The air circulation rate is sufficient to prevent stagnation without creating desiccation. Those are the conditions I have been observing. But you are not just observing them. You are using them. Your storage loss rates, based on the records you showed me, average below 5% across all food types. The accepted rate for conventional cold storage is between 25 and 40%. You have reduced spoilage to a fraction of what agricultural science considers achievable." Marsh closed his notebook and looked at Elijah with an expression that was part respect and part something that looked like envy. "Mr. Cross, you have assembled what may be the most complete empirical record of geothermal food preservation in this country, perhaps on this continent, and you have done it alone, with simple tools, through patient observation of principles that my colleagues in Boston are only beginning to theorize about. I had a good teacher. Your grandfather's journal. My grandfather's example. He could have extracted silver and made himself wealthy. He chose to preserve the cave instead. That choice taught me more than any journal entry ever could." Marsh was quiet for a long moment. "May I have permission to reference your work in my papers?" "You can reference anything you like. Knowledge is not worth much if it is locked in a cave." Marsh smiled faintly. "I believe you meant that as a general statement, but there is an irony in it given where we are sitting." Elijah returned the smile. "The cave keeps vegetables, Knowledge should not be kept, it should be shared. Over the following months, Marsh became a regular visitor to the cave, bringing students from the university to see the chambers and learn the principles of geothermal storage firsthand. Elijah taught them the same way he taught everyone else, by showing them what to observe and then letting them discover the conclusions for themselves. Some of the students were brilliant and saw patterns immediately. Others were slow but thorough and eventually arrived at the same understanding through different paths. All of them left with a deeper appreciation for what could be learned from careful attention to the way the natural world actually worked rather than the way theories said it should work. It was during one of these teaching sessions in October of 1883 that Elijah proposed to Margaret. They were in the spring chamber, checking on preservation work that had been proceeding since July. Margaret was making notes in her record book, documenting the results so she could replicate them in future batches when Elijah spoke. "I need a partner who understands fermentation chemistry and can manage the business side of the operation," he said. "Also, I love you. Will you marry me?" Margaret stopped writing and looked at him. "In that order." "The order does not matter, the answer does." She set down her pen and was quiet for a moment, studying his face in the lamplight that reflected off the wet stone walls and the moving water on the floor. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady, but there was something underneath it that might have been relief, or might have been joy, or might have been both. "Yes," she said, "on all counts." They married in December of 1883 in the Lutheran Church in Pinewood, with Olav and Garrett and Wade as witnesses. The minister was young and earnest and pronounced Elijah's name correctly on the first try, which Margaret later said was a sign that the marriage would last, since, if a Norwegian minister could handle an English name without stumbling, there was hope for any union between people from different worlds. Wade gave them a set of iron cookware as a wedding gift and announced that he was forgiving the last of the small debt that Elijah still owed for supplies purchased years earlier. The debt was only $3, but the gesture was larger than the sum, an acknowledgement that the crazy man in the cave had proven himself to be something else entirely. The years between 1884 and 1890 were years of steady building. Elijah and Margaret expanded the cave system to 2,500 square feet across 7 distinct chambers, each one calibrated for a different purpose. There was the main chamber at 53 degrees for general root vegetable storage, the secondary chamber at 51 degrees for cabbage and squash and other crops that benefited from slightly cooler conditions, the small chamber at 49 degrees, still sealed at the back where Tobias Cross's bones rested undisturbed, for apples and fruits that required temperatures just above freezing, the spring chamber at 42 degrees for meat and dairy, and anything requiring genuine cold, and 3 new chambers that Olav designed specifically for different types of fermentation, each one with carefully controlled humidity and ventilation, that allowed Margaret to produce preserved foods with a consistency and quality that traditional methods could never match. They built a larger cabin above the cave entrance, a proper house with 2 rooms and a sleeping loft, and a stone fireplace that Olav built with the same precision he brought to everything he touched. The house faced south to catch the winter sun and was sheltered from the northwest wind by the hillside behind it. Margaret moved in with Astrid, and the 3 of them, 4 when Olav was included, became a family knit together not by blood but by shared purpose and mutual respect. In 1884, Margaret gave birth to a son they named Tobias, after Elijah's grandfather. The boy was born in March during a late spring snowstorm, delivered by a midwife from Pinewood who rode up through 8 inches of fresh snow because Margaret had sent word 2 days earlier that the time was approaching. Tobias was small and dark-haired like his mother, but he had his father's eyes, gray and observant and missing nothing. In 1887, Margaret gave birth to a daughter they named Ingrid, after Olav. The old stonemason wept when they told him, and he spent the next 3 years building furniture for his namesake, pieces carved from cherry wood that he seasoned in the cave, where the constant temperature and humidity kept the wood stable and prevented the warping and cracking that plagued furniture made in conventional workshops. His final piece, a cradle carved from a single piece of wood with dovetails so fine they were almost invisible, sat in the cave for 20 years before it was needed by Ingrid's own children, and the wood never moved, not a crack, not a warp, not a split. Olav died in 1889 at the age of 68, peacefully in his sleep in the small room he had built for himself in the house above the cave. His last words, spoken to Elijah the evening before he died, were in Norwegian, but Margaret translated them later as something close to, "I built tunnels through mountains in the old country, but this is better. Tunnels move people from place to place. This cave feeds them. That is the higher engineering." They buried him on the hillside above the cave entrance, where he could look down on the timber frame he had rebuilt to last for generations, and the stonework he had taught Elijah to execute with precision. Margaret carved his headstone herself, using techniques her father had taught her, and the inscription read simply, "Olav Lindgren, builder of things that last." The children grew up in and around the cave, learning to read thermometers before they could read books, understanding fermentation chemistry before they understood arithmetic. Tobias, serious and methodical even as a young child, took to the work with the same focus his father brought to observation. By the age of 7, he was helping with the temperature logs, and by 10, he was experimenting with his own preservation techniques, trying variations on his mother's methods, and documenting the results in notebooks that mirrored the meticulous record-keeping that defined the cave's operation. Astrid, who was technically Elijah's stepdaughter but who had never known any father except him, developed an interest in the chemistry underlying the preservation methods they used. She asked questions that neither Elijah nor Margaret could fully answer, questions about why certain bacteria produced certain flavors, about what happened at the molecular level during fermentation, about whether the principles they observed in food preservation could be applied to other types of chemistry. When she was 20, she applied to the University of Montana and was accepted with a scholarship funded by Professor Marsh, who had watched her grow up during his visits to the cave and recognized in her the same observational gifts that made her stepfather such an effective teacher. Ingrid, the youngest, inherited her namesake's love of building and precision. She learned carpentry from watching her mother work and stonework from studying what her grandfather had left behind. By the age of 12, she could joint a board with a steadiness that made grown men careful about their own work. And by 14, she was building furniture in a small workshop that Elijah had helped her set up in the outermost chamber of the cave, where the temperature and humidity kept her wood stable. Through all of this, the cave itself continued to function, as it always had, storing food for a growing number of clients, serving as a teaching facility for the steady stream of students who came to learn geothermal storage principles, and providing the stable conditions that made possible the preservation and fermentation work that had become Margaret's specialty. By 1890, Elijah had taught more than 200 people the principles of geothermal food storage. Some had gone on to build successful cave systems of their own. Others had failed, choosing poor locations or excavating without adequate observation, learning expensive lessons about why patience mattered. But all of them had learned something, and all of them had spread that knowledge to others, and slowly the methods that had begun with one man in one cave were changing the way people across Montana and beyond thought about food preservation. The territorial legislature, responding to pressure from farmers and merchants who had seen the results that proper storage could achieve, allocated funds in 1891 for a comprehensive study of geothermal food preservation. They hired Professor Marsh to lead the study, and Marsh spent 6 months at the cave, measuring and recording and documenting everything that Elijah had learned over 12 years of patient observation. The report that Marsh published in 1892 confirmed what Elijah had always known, but could now prove with data that met academic standards. Geothermal storage, when properly implemented in suitable geological locations, could reduce food spoilage losses from the regional average of 35% to below 5%. The economic impact of this reduction, calculated across the agricultural output of Montana Territory, would be measured in hundreds of thousands of dollars annually. The social impact, measured in reduced hunger and improved nutrition during winter months, was incalculable. The report recommended that the territorial government provide technical assistance and modest financial support to farmers and ranchers who wish to build geothermal storage facilities on their own land. It recommended that the university establish a formal program to teach the principles of geothermal engineering, and it recommended that Elijah Cross be appointed as a consultant to both efforts, with compensation appropriate to the value of the knowledge he would be sharing. Elijah declined the appointment and the compensation. He agreed to continue teaching anyone who wanted to learn, but he refused to accept payment from the government for doing so, and he refused to affiliate formally with the university, even though Marsh offered him a professorship that would have paid more in a year than he had earned in the previous 5. His reason was the same reason he had given the territorial governor 9 years earlier. The moment he accepted institutional payment for knowledge, that knowledge became his to control rather than everyone's to use. It changed what he was and what the cave represented. It turned a public resource into a private asset, and he had seen too many public resources become private assets to believe that the transformation ever served anyone except the person who owned the asset. So he continued as he always had, teaching freely, sharing data openly, helping anyone who asked for help, and turning away anyone who wanted him to do the work for them. It was not idealism exactly, though idealism was part of it. It was more a practical recognition that knowledge that could be locked away was knowledge that would eventually be lost, while knowledge that was shared freely would continue to spread and improve and adapt long after the original discoverer was gone. In 1895, Tobias, now 11 years old, made a discovery that would reshape Elijah's understanding of what his grandfather had left behind. The boy had been exploring the sealed chamber where Tobias Cross's remains rested, fascinated by the fact that there was a part of the cave system that remained untouched and unexplored. Elijah had told him the story of the silver vein and the choice to preserve rather than extract, but he had never shown him the exact location of the sealed entrance because there had seemed no reason to disturb what his grandfather had deliberately hidden. But Tobias was persistent in the way that intelligent children are persistent, and one afternoon while Elijah was working in the spring chamber, the boy came running with a piece of paper he had found wedged between stones in the wall of the small chamber. The paper was old and brittle, folded multiple times, and sealed with wax that had long since cracked and fallen away. Elijah unfolded it carefully and found writing in his grandfather's hand, a letter dated 1844 and addressed to whoever eventually found the cave. The letter explained what Elijah already knew about the silver vein and the decision to seal it, but then it continued with information he had not known. Behind the silver chamber, his grandfather had written, "There is a third chamber that I sealed separately. This chamber contains no silver and no monetary value. What it contains is more valuable than silver if you understand what value actually means. I have placed their seeds from every crop I have successfully grown in this territory, sealed in containers that should protect them from moisture and time. Also cuttings from fruit trees that thrive in this climate, preserved in a medium that should keep them viable for decades if the temperature remains stable. The cave's constant cold will preserve these seeds far longer than any surface storage could preserve them. They are my insurance against the future. Not financial insurance, but the insurance of knowledge preserved in living form. If you find this chamber, plant the seeds. Some will have died. Some will grow. Pass forward what grows. That is the legacy that matters. Below the letter were detailed coordinates for the location of the seed chamber. Elijah and Tobias spent the next week carefully removing the stones that sealed the passage Tobias' cross had described. Behind the seal they found a chamber roughly 10 feet across and 8 feet deep, and on stone shelves that lined the walls were dozens of glass jars sealed with wax, each one containing seeds wrapped in paper and labeled with his grandfather's careful handwriting. Winter wheat from Sweden, potato varieties from Scotland and Ireland, bean seeds from 6 different strains, apple cuttings preserved in a matrix of clay and moss, cuttings from pear and plum trees, seeds from herbs and vegetables that Elijah did not even recognize by their written names. Some of the jars, when opened, contained seeds that had died, turned to dust by the decades even in the stable cold of the cave. But others, remarkably, contained seeds that still looked viable, dry and hard, and waiting for conditions that would wake them from their long sleep. Elijah and Tobias planted the viable seeds that spring, not knowing what would grow and what would fail. Of the 43 varieties they planted, 19 germinated and grew. Some of them were crops that were still commonly grown, and their value was mainly historical, proof that seeds could be preserved for 50 years and still produce. But others were varieties that had been lost to cultivation, heirloom strains that had fallen out of favor as agriculture commercialized and standardized. These lost varieties, brought back to life from his grandfather's seed vault, represented genetic diversity that would have otherwise been extinct. Over the following years, Elijah and his family grew these heirloom crops and saved their seeds and distributed them to farmers across the territory. Some of the varieties proved superior to modern cultivars in specific conditions. The Swedish wheat grew better at high altitude than any commercial strain. One of the potato varieties showed remarkable resistance to blight. An heirloom apple produced fruit that stored longer in the cave than any other variety they tested. By 1900, seeds from Tobias Cross's hidden vault were growing in fields and gardens across Montana and into Idaho and Wyoming. Farmers who planted them saved their own seeds and passed them along to neighbors, and slowly a network of heirloom crop preservation began to spread, built not on institutional programs or government funding, but on the simple recognition that some things were worth preserving because they worked, and working things should not be lost just because newer things existed. Elijah was 47 years old in the year 1900, his hair going gray and his hands scarred and thickened by 20 years of work in stone and soil, but still steady and still capable of the precision that the cave's operation required. He had built something that had outlasted any prediction he might have made when he first walked into these mountains with nothing but his grandfather's broken instruments, and a faith that observation would reveal what action alone could never create. The cave fed more than 300 families now, either directly through storage services or indirectly through the crops grown from seeds preserved in its stable cold. It had spawned 47 similar facilities across the territory, some successful and some failed, but all of them representing the spread of knowledge that could not be contained once it was properly shared. It had taught principles to more than 500 students, who had in turn taught others, creating a cascade of understanding that touched thousands of lives in ways that could never be fully tracked or measured. And it had proven what Tobias Cross had believed when he sealed the silver and left the map instead, that some things, once built properly, create value that compounds over time in ways that extraction can never match. That patience and observation, applied consistently over years and decades, could solve problems that force and speed could never touch. That a man who chose to preserve rather than exploit, to teach rather than control, to share rather than hoard, could build a legacy that would outlast any fortune and touch more lives than any amount of wealth ever would. Elijah Cross had honored his grandfather's choice by making the same choice himself. And now, as he watched his children grow and his students spread across the territory, and his cave continue its patient work of preservation that asked nothing except that people use it wisely, he understood what legacy actually meant. It meant building something that would work long after you were gone. It meant teaching principles that others could apply in ways you never imagined. It meant trusting that knowledge shared freely would multiply and improve, while knowledge hoarded would stagnate and die. It meant listening to the mountain instead of trying to conquer it. It meant observing what was there instead of imposing what you wanted. It meant understanding that the earth would provide for those patient enough to learn its language. His grandfather had understood all of this, and he had left behind not wealth but wisdom. And Elijah Cross, the son who had been rejected and cast out and told he was worth nothing, had taken that wisdom and built from it something that proved his family wrong in the most complete and permanent way possible. By being right about what actually mattered. The years between 1900 and 1918 were years of completion rather than expansion, of refinement rather than innovation, of watching what had been built prove itself through the simple test of continued function across changing seasons and shifting circumstances. Elijah Cross, who had arrived at Cold Mountain in 1879 with nothing but broken surveying instruments, and his grandfather's faith that observation mattered more than ownership, was now 65 years old and widely recognized as the man who had changed how the Northern Territories thought about food preservation. But recognition had never been his goal, and in his 7th decade of life, he worked with the same patient focus he had brought to his first week in the cave, measuring temperatures 3 times daily, recording observations in notebooks that now numbered 36 volumes, teaching anyone who asked to learn. The cave system had reached its final form. 7 chambers totaling 4,500 square feet, each one serving a specific purpose in the careful orchestration of preservation that kept food fresh across seasons that would have reduced it to rot or freezing in any conventional storage. The temperatures ranged from 42 degrees in the spring chamber, where cold water still flowed across stone floors, carved to channel it precisely, to 55 degrees in the entrance chamber, where external conditions had the most influence, but where the thermal mass of stone still moderated the wild swings of Montana weather. Tobias, Elijah's son, had taken over the daily operations of the cave in 1905 when he turned 21. He ran it with the same methodical precision his father had established, but he brought to the work a quality that Elijah recognized as different from his own approach. Where Elijah observed and recorded and taught, Tobias systematized and optimized, and expanded the teaching into formal curriculum. By 1910, he had written a textbook titled Principles of Geothermal Food Preservation that was being used in agricultural programs across 6 western states. The textbook was published by the University of Montana, with all proceeds going to a scholarship fund that Tobias had established to help students from farming families attend university and study the scientific principles underlying the work their families did by tradition and intuition. Astrid, who was technically Elijah's stepdaughter, but who had never made that distinction in her own mind or anyone else's, had become the first woman to earn a degree in chemistry from the University of Montana. She graduated in 1900 at the age of 26, and she spent the next 8 years teaching chemistry at the university, while conducting research on fermentation processes that drew heavily on the work her mother had pioneered in the cave. In 1908, she published a paper in the Journal of Agricultural Chemistry that detailed the bacterial cultures responsible for the preservation and flavor development in Norwegian fermented fish, work that established her reputation as one of the leading fermentation chemists in the country. The paper acknowledged in its first paragraph that the research had been conducted in her stepfather's geothermal cave, and that without the precise temperature control that cave provided, the work would not have been possible. Ingrid, the youngest of the children, had followed her grandfather Olav into stonemason work, though she approached it from a different angle than the old Norwegian had. Where Olav had been a builder of tunnels and support structures, things meant to be functional and hidden, Ingrid was an artist who worked in stone. She carved decorative pieces and functional furniture and architectural elements that combined Olav's precision with an aesthetic sense that was entirely her own. She maintained a workshop in the outermost chamber of the cave, where the stable temperature and humidity kept her stone from fracturing during the carving process, and her work was sought after by builders and homeowners across the territory. She never married, dedicating herself to her craft with a focus that reminded everyone who knew her of her grandfather, and she trained 6 apprentices over the years, passing forward the knowledge that Olav had passed to her father and that her father had encouraged her to develop in her own direction. Margaret continued to run the fermentation side of the cave operation until she was 70 years old. Her preserved fish and fermented vegetables were still regarded as the finest available anywhere in Montana, and she had trained a dozen other women in her methods, creating a small industry of Norwegian-style preservation that employed people across 3 counties. She had also continued to document her work with the same systematic rigor that characterized everything associated with the cave, and by 1915, she had filled 8 notebooks with recipes and techniques and observations about how different conditions affected fermentation outcomes. When a food historian from the Smithsonian Institution visited the cave in 1916, he called Margaret's notebooks the most complete record of traditional Scandinavian food preservation techniques in existence, a primary source document that would be invaluable to future researchers trying to understand how immigrant communities had adapted their traditional knowledge to American conditions. Garrett, who had once laughed at his younger brother for choosing education over inheritance, had become one of Elijah's most devoted students and one of the cave's most effective advocates. He had built his own geothermal storage facility on his ranch in 1884, applying everything Elijah and Olav had taught him. And while it did not work quite as well as the original cave because the geology was not identical, it worked well enough to reduce his storage losses by 70%. He spent his later years traveling to other ranches and farms, helping people assess their land for suitable cave locations, teaching the principles of observation and patient excavation, spreading the knowledge that his brother had proven and systematized. He died in 1912 at the age of 70, and at his funeral more than 200 people came to pay respects, many of them farmers and ranchers whose operations had been transformed by the storage methods he had taught them. Elijah spoke at the funeral briefly, saying only that his brother had learned late but learned thoroughly, and that a man who could admit he was wrong and then spend decades making it right was a man worthy of respect. The younger brother Donovan had taken a different path. After his wife Marion left him in 1885, he had sold his portion of the family ranch and bought a smaller spread in a valley 20 miles south of Pinewood. He married a schoolteacher named Evelyn in 1887, and they raised 4 children together in what everyone agreed was one of the happiest marriages anyone in the county had seen. Donovan visited the cave occasionally, usually bringing one or another of his children to see what their uncle had built, and while he never became involved in the cave operation or the teaching program, he remained close to Elijah in a way that the early years of their relationship would have made impossible to predict. He outlived Garrett by 6 years, dying in 1918 at the age of 73, and his children continued to visit the cave and use it for storage long after he was gone. By 1915, Elijah's health had begun to decline in ways that could not be ignored or worked around. He had spent 36 years breathing rock dust from excavation and stone carving, and his lungs had paid the price that such work always extracted. He developed a cough that would not clear, a persistent rasp that grew worse through the winter of 1915 and did not improve when spring came. A doctor from Missoula examined him and delivered a diagnosis that surprised no one who knew the nature of his work. Silicosis, the stone worker's disease, the same condition that had killed miners and quarrymen and masons for as long as men had cut rock for a living. There was no treatment and no cure, only time, measured in months or perhaps a year or two if he was lucky and careful. Elijah received the diagnosis with the same calm he had brought to every other challenge in his life. He asked the doctor how long he could expect to continue working, and when the doctor said that continuing to work in dusty conditions would accelerate the decline, Elijah nodded and thanked him for his honesty, and then went back to work the next day because the alternative was to stop doing the thing that had defined his life, and stopping seemed like a form of death that would arrive before the actual dying did. He continued to take his temperature readings, though now Tobias or Margaret or one of the grandchildren usually accompanied him through the chambers because the walking left him breathless, and the stairs that connected the different levels of the cave had become difficult to navigate without assistance. He continued to teach, though now he did it sitting on a stool in the main chamber rather than leading people through the full tour of all 7 chambers. He continued to record observations in his notebooks, though his handwriting had become shaky, and sometimes Margaret would transcribe what he dictated, because writing itself had become an effort that left him exhausted. Through the fall and winter of 1917, he grew steadily weaker. The cough that had been persistent became constant. The breathlessness that had been occasional became permanent. By December, he could no longer make it to the cave entrance without stopping to rest, and by January, he was confined to the house above the cave, sitting in a chair by the south-facing window, where he could at least see the timber entrance that Olav had built to last for generations, and the hillside where his grandfather had left him a map to something more valuable than silver. Margaret sat with him most days, reading aloud from the agricultural journals that still published articles about geothermal storage, many of them referencing the Cross method or the Montana cave system, or simply Elijah Cross's principles. Sometimes she would read from his own notebooks, going back through 38 years of observations and measurements and discoveries, reminding him of what he had learned and built and taught. He listened with his eyes closed, occasionally nodding or making a small sound of recognition when she read something that triggered a memory. On a morning in March of 1918, with the last of winter's snow melting from the south-facing slope and the first green shoots of early spring plants pushing through the leaf litter, Elijah's children and grandchildren gathered in the house. They had been gathering often in recent weeks as it became clear that the time was approaching, but this morning there was a quality to the light and the air that made it obvious that this would be the day. Tobias stood at the foot of the bed that Olav had built 30 years before, its joints still tight and its surface worn smooth by decades of use. Astrid sat by the window, her arms crossed in the way they always crossed when she was trying not to cry. Ingrid stood near the door with her infant daughter in her arms, the first grandchild, born 3 weeks earlier and sleeping in the cherry cradle that Olav had carved, and the cave had preserved without a mark or a warp for 28 years. Margaret sat beside Elijah, her hand on his, and when he opened his eyes and saw them all there, he smiled faintly. "The mountain will tell you what it needs," he said to Tobias, his voice barely above a whisper. "Do not assume you know. Measure, record, pay attention to what changes and what does not change." Tobias nodded, though tears were running down his face and his voice when he spoke was unsteady. "I will." To Astrid, who had come from Missoula when word reached her that the end was near, Elijah said, "You proved that observation leads to understanding and understanding leads to knowledge that can be shared. Keep proving it. The world needs people who can see what is actually there." Astrid could not speak. She nodded and turned toward the window. To Ingrid, who was trying to comfort her daughter while her own grief made comfort impossible, he said, "You build things that last. Your grandfather knew that. The world does not need more things. It needs better ones. Keep building better." And then to Margaret, he said something that she never repeated to anyone, but the look on her face when he said it suggested that whatever the words were, they were sufficient. His last words to the room at large, spoken as the morning light turned golden and the first birds began to call in the aspens on the hillside, were simple. "There is always more to find," he said. "Keep looking." He closed his eyes. The room was quiet except for the small sounds of breathing and crying, and the whisper of wind through the cracks around the window frame. Margaret held his hand and felt the moment when the grip went slack, when the breath that had been labored and rasping for months simply stopped, when the man who had listened to mountains and learned their language passed from the world he had studied so carefully into whatever came after. They buried him 3 days later on the hillside above the cave, next to Olav, in a spot where he could look down on everything he had built. The funeral was attended by more than 400 people, farmers and ranchers from 6 counties, students he had taught over nearly 4 decades, merchants whose businesses had been transformed by the storage methods he had shared, university professors who had built their careers on principles he had discovered through patient observation, territorial officials who had tried repeatedly to hire him and had been refused each time with explanations about knowledge that should not be controlled. Tobias spoke briefly, saying that his father had believed observation was the highest form of respect, that to truly see something required you to set aside what you wanted it to be and accept what it actually was, and that this principle had guided everything from his approach to geology to his approach to family to his approach to teaching. Margaret spoke even more briefly, saying only that Elijah had understood that some things were worth more than money, and that he had spent his life proving it, and that the proof was still here in the cave and the gardens, and the people who had learned from him. The headstone that Ingrid carved for her father was simple granite, cut and polished with the precision that Olav had taught her, and the inscription read, "Elijah Cross, 1853 to 1918. He listened first." Margaret lived until 1924. She continued to run the fermentation side of the cave operation until she was 72 years old, and even after age forced her to stop the physical work, she continued to advise and teach and document. She added 2 more notebooks to the collection, bringing the total to 38 volumes that documented 46 years of work in food preservation and fermentation. When a researcher from the University of Montana cataloged the notebooks in 1952, he described them as without parallel in the amateur agricultural literature of the 19th and early 20th centuries, a complete record of empirical investigation conducted by 2 people who had no formal training, but who understood the scientific method better than many who held advanced degrees. She died peacefully in her sleep on a summer night in 1924, and they buried her next to Elijah on the hillside where she could look down on the cave that had been the center of her adult life. Her headstone, also carved by Ingrid, read simply, "Margaret Cross, 1852 to 1924. She taught preservation." Tobias ran the cave until 1945. He expanded it one final time in 1925, adding an eighth chamber that he dedicated specifically to seed storage, an idea his father had discussed in his final years but had never completed. The seed storage chamber operated at a constant 48 degrees with carefully controlled humidity, and seeds stored their maintained viability for years longer than seeds stored in conventional facilities. Tobias proved this through meticulous germination trials that he documented in the same style his father had established, and his records later confirmed that some of the seed varieties stored in the cave during the 1890s were still viable when tested in the 1920s, having been maintained for 30 years in conditions that modern seed banks would spend millions of dollars to replicate. Tobias died in 1956 at the age of 72, having spent 51 years working in or around the cave that his father had discovered and developed. His children and grandchildren continued the operation, each generation adding small improvements and adaptations, but always maintaining the core principles that Elijah had established: observation before action, understanding before building, service before profit, knowledge shared freely rather than controlled exclusively. Astrid made her final contribution to the cave's legacy in 1935, when she endowed a scholarship at the University of Montana, specifically for students studying food science or agricultural chemistry. The scholarship was funded by royalties from her published research papers and from patents she had obtained on certain fermentation processes, and it was named the Tobias Cross Memorial Scholarship in honor of her great-grandfather, who had first understood that preservation mattered more than extraction. The scholarship has funded more than 300 students since its establishment, and many of those students have gone on to careers in food science and agricultural research that trace their intellectual lineage directly back to the principles that Elijah Cross discovered through patient observation of what a Montana mountain was willing to teach. The cave itself still exists. It sits on a wooded hillside in what is now Beaverhead County, Montana, accessible by a gravel road that branches off a state highway 6 miles south of the town that grew from what was once called Pinewood. The original cabin is gone, replaced in the 1930s by a modest house that Tobias built for his growing family. But the cave entrance with its timber frame still stands, the original oak darkened to the color of old iron but structurally sound, Olav's mortise and tenon joinery as tight as the day it was cut. The frame has been reinforced and repaired over the decades, but the core structure remains what the old stonemason built in 1883 with the intention that it last for generations. The interior of the cave is much as Elijah left it: 8 chambers totaling 6,200 square feet, each one maintaining its designated temperature within a degree or two of what the original measurements recorded. The spring chamber still runs at 42 degrees. The innermost chamber, where Tobias Cross's bones were moved to a proper burial in 1920, but where the sense of his presence somehow remains, still holds at 49 degrees. The main chamber still averages 53 degrees, and on the wall where Elijah hung his first thermometer in 1879, a modern digital sensor now records the temperature continuously, feeding data to a monitoring system, while an analog mercury thermometer hangs beside it as backup, a reminder that technology changes but principles endure. The cave is owned by the Cross Family Trust and operated by Elijah's great-great-grandchildren, who maintain it as both a working storage facility and an educational site. It was designated a National Historic Landmark in 1976, recognized not just for its historical significance, but for its continuing demonstration that properly designed passive systems can outperform energy-intensive modern alternatives. The designation came with federal protection but no federal funding, exactly as the family wanted it, keeping control local and ensuring that the cave remained what Elijah had always insisted it should be, a public resource available to anyone willing to learn from it. The cave still serves its original purpose. More than 80 families use it for food storage, paying modest fees that cover maintenance costs but generate no profit. The fees have not increased since 1985, and the waiting list for storage space is maintained not by price but by need, with preference given to small farmers and families who cannot afford commercial storage alternatives. 20 regional businesses use the cave for specialty storage, particularly for heirloom seed preservation and small batch fermentation work that requires precise temperature control. The teaching program that Elijah established in the 1880s continues. Every summer, the cave hosts workshops on geothermal storage principles, fermentation chemistry, sustainable food preservation, and seed saving. The workshops are taught by family members and by university researchers who have studied the cross method, and they attract participants from across the country and occasionally from overseas. The workshops are free, funded by the small endowment that Tobias established and by donations from people who believe that knowledge this practical and this proven should be available to anyone willing to learn it. The notebooks that Elijah and Margaret filled over 46 years are housed in climate-controlled archives at the University of Montana, but complete digital copies are freely available online, downloadable by anyone who wants to study the observations and methods that produced such remarkable results. The notebooks have been referenced in more than 200 published research papers on topics ranging from geothermal engineering to fermentation science, to seed preservation, to the history of agricultural innovation in the American West. The seed bank that Tobias Cross established in 1844 and that his great-grandson expanded in 1925 now contains more than 800 heirloom varieties, making it one of the most significant non-institutional seed preservation efforts in the country. Seeds from the Cross Cave collection are distributed free to farmers, gardeners, and preservation organizations, with only one condition attached. Anyone who receives seeds must agree to grow them, save seeds from what they grow, and share those seeds with others. This simple requirement has created a network of heirloom crop preservation that extends across 40 states and into 3 Canadian provinces, a living legacy that grows and spreads and adapts while remaining rooted in principles that a man with broken surveying instruments discovered by listening to what a mountain was willing to teach. On a morning in March of 2024, exactly 106 years after Elijah Cross took his last breath in a cabin above the cave he had spent his life developing, his great-great-granddaughter stands at the cave entrance giving a tour to a group of high school students from Missoula. Her name is Alina Cross. She is 32 years old, and she holds a degree in geological engineering from the Colorado School of Mines, the same institution where her great-great-grandfather studied in the 1870s. She leads the students through the chambers, showing them the temperature gradients, explaining the ventilation system, demonstrating how passive geothermal principles can create climate control that requires no external energy input. She shows them the original mercury thermometers that still hang beside modern digital sensors. She shows them the stone shelves that Olav carved with precision measured in 1/16 of inches. She shows them the water channels in the spring chamber that still carry cold water across stone floors exactly as Elijah designed them in 1882. In the main chamber she stops and points to marks on the wall, shallow grooves in the stone that curve with a particular rhythm, distinctive as handwriting, permanent as the rock they are carved into. "These are my great-great-grandfather's tool marks," she says. "See how they follow the grain of the stone. He did not fight the rock. He listened to where the stone wanted to split, and he worked with that instead of against it." One of the students, a boy perhaps 16 years old, asks the question that Alina hears most often. Why did he not get rich from this? He could have charged whatever he wanted. He did get rich, Alina says, just not in money. He got rich in legacy. We are standing in something he built in 1879. It is 2024 and this cave still works exactly as he designed it. The temperature right now is 53 degrees, the same as it was 145 years ago. How many millionaires from 1879 can say their work still functions perfectly today? She shows them Elijah's original surveying compass, displayed in a case near the entrance. The brass green with age and the glass cracked, but the mechanism still functional. She shows them pages from his notebooks, protected behind glass, showing temperature readings from January 1881 recorded in handwriting that is precise and patient, and completely focused on what the measurements revealed rather than what anyone wanted them to reveal. She shows them seeds from the heirloom collection, including wheat that came from Tobias Cross's sealed chamber in 1844, preserved in the cave for 51 years and still viable, grown and saved, and distributed for another 70 years, until it became one of the standard heritage wheat varieties in the northern plains. At the end of the tour, she takes them outside to the hillside where 3 graves sit beneath the aspens, simple granite markers that catch the morning sun. Elijah Cross, Margaret Cross, Olav Lindgren. The students stand quietly, which is unusual for high school students anywhere, but which seems to happen naturally in this place where the weight of what was built, and why it was built, and how long it has lasted presses down on even the most distracted teenage mind. My great-great-grandfather was kicked out of his family for being too educated, Alina says. They thought studying rocks instead of ranching was a waste of time. They gave him nothing when their father died, but he took what his own grandfather left him, which was not property or money but knowledge and maps and the faith that observation mattered more than ownership. And he built this, and it is still here, still working, still teaching, still proving every single day that some things matter more than the things most people spend their lives chasing. One of the students asks if she ever wishes her great-great-grandfather had taken the money he was offered, the government contracts and university positions, and all the wealth he could have accumulated. Alina considers the question seriously. Then she gestures at the cave entrance, at the hillside, at the forest that surrounds this place that has been teaching patience and observation, and the value of building things that last for more than a century. He made a choice, she says, extraction versus preservation, control versus sharing, wealth that dies with you versus knowledge that lives after you. I am standing here because he made the choice he made. Thousands of people have learned from this place because he made the choice he made. Seeds that would be extinct are growing in fields across the country because he made the choice he made. So no, I do not wish he had chosen differently. I am grateful every day that he understood what actually mattered. The students leave and Alina stays, walking through the chambers one more time in the afternoon quiet, checking temperatures and making notes, and continuing the work that her great-great-grandfather began when he walked into these mountains with nothing and found everything that would ever matter to him. The cave breathes its patient breath. The stone holds its steady temperature. The water flows across floors carved to channel it precisely. And somewhere in the molecular structure of seeds preserved in the 8th chamber, in the bacterial cultures that ferment fish and vegetables in the controlled climate of the secondary chamber, in the heirloom wheat growing in Montana fields, and the teaching spreading through workshops, and the knowledge documented in notebooks that anyone can read, the legacy continues. Not because Elijah Cross built something that generated wealth, but because he built something that generated wisdom. Not because he owned something valuable, but because he understood something true. Not because he conquered a mountain, but because he listened to what the mountain was willing to teach, and then spent his life teaching others to listen just as carefully. And that, in the end, is what legacy actually means. Building something that works long after you are gone. Teaching principles that others can apply in ways you never imagined. Trusting that knowledge shared freely will multiply and improve, while knowledge hoarded will stagnate and die. The earth holds its heat steady. You just have to give it rooms. Elijah Cross gave it rooms, and the mountain in return gave him everything his family had refused: shelter, purpose, abundance, and a legacy that has outlasted every acre his brothers fought over, every dollar they accumulated, every plan they made for wealth that dissolved like morning frost when the sun finally rose on what actually endured. He listened first. He observed before he built. He served before he profited. He shared instead of hoarding. And in doing so, he proved what his grandfather had known and what the mountain had been willing to teach anyone patient enough to hear: that some things, once built properly, last forever.